My name is Lydia, 34 years old, and after my parents died in a tragic accident, my older brother threw me and my 7-year-old son out into the freezing rain with absolutely nothing. He stood in the doorway of our family home flanked by private security and told me I was a failure who had overstayed her welcome. Days later, at the reading of the will, he actually smirked and told me I had lost everything. But when the estate lawyer revealed what my mother had really left me in secret, my brother completely collapsed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who completely underestimated what you are capable of. The freezing Chicago rain felt like tiny needles against my skin as I stood on the front porch of the only home I had ever known. My black morning dress clung uncomfortably to my legs, completely soaked through, and the chill was beginning to seep directly into my bones. I held my 7-year-old son Leo tightly against my side, trying to shield him from the relentless downpour with a battered umbrella. We had just come from the cemetery. We had just watched 2 mahogany caskets being lowered into the damp earth, marking the end of a grueling, heartbreaking chapter. My parents had passed away in a devastating accident, leaving behind a massive estate and a family dynamic that was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces. I shivered, shifting my weight as I reached into my purse with numb fingers to find my house keys. All I wanted was to get Leo inside, run a hot bath for him, and finally allow myself a moment to break down and cry. For the past 6 months, I had put my entire life on hold. I had practically lived in this massive echoing house, administering medications, organizing hospice care, and holding my parents' hands as they faded away. I was exhausted in a way that sleep could never fix. I finally pulled my brass key from my bag and pushed it into the heavy lock of the grand oak door. But it would not turn. I jiggled the handle, pushing my shoulder against the thick wood, assuming the old mechanism was just sticking in the cold weather. I tried again, pushing harder, but the cylinder was completely rigid. The locks had been changed. Before I could even process what that meant, the heavy door swung inward. Warm, dry air spilled out from the foyer, carrying the familiar scent of lemon polish and my mother's favorite vanilla candles. But the person standing in the doorway was not a comforting sight. It was my older brother, Harrison. He was 37 years old, wearing a pristine, custom-tailored charcoal suit that did not have a single wrinkle or drop of water on it. He looked perfectly composed, completely untouched by the grief that was currently tearing me apart. Flanking him was a massive man in a dark uniform with an earpiece, a private security guard. Harrison stood there looking down at me with a cold, calculated smirk that made my stomach twist into a painful knot. "What is going on, Harrison?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly from the cold. "Why does my key not work? Let us inside. Leo is freezing." Harrison did not move an inch. Instead, he reached behind the heavy oak door and dragged out a large black plastic garbage bag. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it directly onto the wet driveway. The thin plastic tore open as it hit a deep puddle, and Leo's favorite stuffed animals, his school clothes and his drawing books, spilled out into the muddy water. Leo let out a small cry and buried his face in my coat. I stared at the ruined toys, my mind struggling to catch up with the cruelty of the moment. "You do not live here anymore," Lydia Harrison said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have 24 hours to clear the rest of your junk out of the guest house, but you are not stepping foot inside the main property." "Are you out of your mind?" I demanded, tightening my grip on Leo. "Mom and Dad just died. We just left their funeral. This is my home too." Harrison let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed into the rainy street. "This was never your home. You were a guest. Did you really think playing nursemaid for the last 6 months entitled you to this estate? You think changing their bedpans means you get a slice of the pie?" I stared at him in disbelief. "I took care of them because they were our parents, Harrison. I was here every single day while you were downtown playing pretend with your tech firm. You did not even visit them in the hospital when they asked for you." "Do not try to guilt trip me," he snapped, stepping closer to the edge of the porch, shielded from the rain by the massive awning. I was busy running a multi-million-dollar investment firm. I have actual responsibilities. I am building a legacy. Dad understood that. That is why he gave me full power of attorney before the accident. I am in charge now. You are just a tenant who has severely overstayed her welcome. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his expensive suit. You are a single mother and a college dropout, Lydia. You failed out of law school to pursue some pathetic little hobby, and they let you hide out here because they pitied you. But the charity ends today. I am moving my family into the main house this weekend. Go find a shelter. Or a cheap studio apartment. I really do not care. Just get off my property before I have my security team escort you off for trespassing. The rain continued to beat down on the pavement, washing the mud over Leo's scattered belongings. Any normal person would have screamed. Any normal sister would have thrown herself at him, crying and begging for compassion, demanding to know how a brother could be so heartless on the day of their parents' funeral. But I was not a normal person, and I had learned a very long time ago that showing Harrison any trace of emotion only gave him the power he so desperately craved. He wanted me to break down. He wanted me to look weak and pathetic in front of his hired muscle. He wanted to feel like the supreme ruler of the family. I did not give him a single drop of satisfaction. I kept my face completely blank, a mask of pure, unbothered stone. I knelt down into the freezing puddle, ignoring the muddy water soaking into my black tights, and carefully picked up Leo's sodden stuffed bear. I placed it back into the torn plastic bag, gathered the rest of his wet clothes, and stood back up. I pulled Leo securely under the umbrella and looked my brother dead in the eye. You are going to deeply regret this, Harrison. I said, my voice so quiet and terrifyingly calm that the security guard actually shifted uncomfortably on his feet. Harrison scoffed, rolling his eyes. Oh, I am shaking. What are you going to do? Lydia, sue me. With what money I froze the joint family accounts an hour ago. You have zero access to the estate. You are broke. Have fun walking to the bus stop. With a final arrogant smirk, he stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The loud click of the deadbolt echoed like a gunshot through the rain. Mommy, where are we going to sleep tonight? Leo whispered, his teeth chattering as he looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Do not worry, baby, I said softly, kissing the top of his wet head. We are going to sleep somewhere very warm and very nice. I guided him away from the towering mansion and walked down the long, winding driveway toward my unremarkable, sensible sedan parked on the street. It was a modest car, a carefully calculated choice designed to make me blend in. For years, I had allowed my family to believe their own narrative. I let them think I was a struggling single mother who had given up on her dreams. I let them believe I was a financial burden, a sweet but ultimately useless relative who needed a place to stay. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. I buckled Leo into his car seat, turned the heater on high, and climbed into the driver's seat. The rain hammered against the windshield, blurring the view of the grand estate that Harrison believed he now completely owned. I reached into the hidden compartment of my bag, bypassing the worn leather wallet I carried for show, and pulled out a sleek, heavy titanium black card. It was an invitation-only credit card, the kind reserved for individuals with staggering liquid wealth. I was not a law school dropout. I had left law school to launch my own firm, and over the past decade, I had become a highly successful corporate restructuring executive. I specialized in foreclosures, hostile takeovers, and dismantling corrupt corporations. I dismantled fraudulent empires for a living, and I had built a massive fortune doing it. I had hidden my wealth meticulously because my parents had a long, toxic history of enabling Harrison draining their own accounts to bail out his reckless business ventures and demanding I sacrifice my savings to do the same. I stared at the closed front door of the house, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. Harrison thought he had just won the ultimate victory. He thought he had left me destitute and desperate in the street. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct unlisted number for my private wealth manager. Good afternoon, Lydia, the crisp professional voice answered on the first ring. How can I assist you today? I need the presidential penthouse suite at the downtown plaza booked for the next week, I said smoothly, watching the rain wash over the windshield. And I need you to initiate a total freeze on all the secondary credit lines tied to the family estate. Cancel them immediately. Understood. Consider it done. Is there anything else? Yes, I replied, my smile widening as I put the car into gear. Harrison just tried to lock me out of the accounts. He took the bait perfectly. Prepare the legal team. It is time to start the audit. My phone vibrated violently against the center console before my wealth manager even disconnected the call. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of notifications, transforming my quiet car into a buzzing hive of digital panic. I glanced at the display as I merged onto the rain-slicked interstate, heading toward downtown Chicago. It was a mass group text from Harrison sent to every aunt, uncle, and older cousin in our sprawling family directory. I tapped the screen at a red light, reading the block of text he had hastily typed out. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. He claimed that I had just fled the estate with a trash bag full of stolen goods. He told them I had raided our mother's wall safe, taken her vintage jewelry, and attempted to drain the primary operating accounts before he caught me. He painted a picture of himself as the valiant protector of the family legacy, forced to physically remove his unstable, thieving sister to protect what little our parents had left behind. The echo chamber activated immediately. My voicemail inbox began filling up before I even passed the city limits. I connected the audio to my car's Bluetooth, listening to the vitriol pour through the speakers while the windshield wipers slapped rhythmically against the glass. The first message was from my Aunt Clara, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. She called me a parasitic disgrace, screaming that I had no respect for the dead and that Harrison was a saint for putting up with my freeloading all these years. Next was Uncle Robert, his deep voice thick with disgust, telling me that I was dead to the extended family and that I should be grateful Harrison was not calling the police. They praised my brother for stepping up during a tragedy. They called him the rightful heir. They called me a dropout who had finally shown her true ugly colors. I did not grip the steering wheel tighter. I did not yell back at the recorded voices. I simply let the voicemails play one after another, letting their toxic words wash over me without leaving a single mark. I had spent my entire life as the designated scapegoat for this family, absorbing their misplaced anger and covering for Harrison's endless inadequacies. But today, their harsh words were nothing but empty noise. I turned off the audio system as the towering glass and steel skyline of Chicago rose up before me, disappearing into the low-hanging gray clouds. I bypassed the budget motels and cheap apartments Harrison assumed I would be forced to seek out. Instead, I pulled my unremarkable sedan into the underground private valet entrance of the most exclusive five-star hotel in the financial district. The moment my tires crossed the heated concrete, a valet in a tailored uniform stepped forward. He opened my door, shielding Leo and me with a massive umbrella, and smiled warmly. "Welcome back, Ms. Vance. We have the penthouse prepared for you just as you requested." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied, handing him the keys. "Please ensure my car is fully detailed and bring the bags up through the private elevator." I carried a sleepy Leo through the discreet VIP entrance, bypassing the main lobby entirely. The concierge greeted me by name, handing me a set of heavy, encrypted keycards. Within minutes, the private elevator deposited us directly into the sprawling multi-level penthouse suite overlooking the Chicago River. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, showcasing the glittering city below. I carried Leo into the master bedroom, tucked him under a thick down comforter, and kissed his forehead. He was safe. He was warm. And he would never have to deal with the cruelty of my family ever again. I walked into the massive living room, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and sat down at the heavy mahogany desk near the window. I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out my encrypted military-grade laptop. It was time to peel back the layers of the grand illusion my family had forced me to live. I was not a struggling dropout. I was not a penniless single mother begging for scraps from the family table. I was a highly ruthless multimillionaire corporate restructuring executive. Years ago, I had realized that law school was a slow, archaic path. I had left my studies, much to my parents' loud public horror, to join a highly aggressive boutique financial restructuring firm. I had a rare, almost terrifying talent for spotting hidden assets, untangling corporate fraud, and dismantling corrupt companies. Within 5 years, I had bought out the senior partners. Within 10, I had amassed a personal fortune that dwarfed my parents' entire net worth. But I had kept every single dime of it hidden. I drove a sensible car, wore modest clothes, and let my family mock my supposed lack of ambition. I hid my wealth because I knew exactly what would happen if they found out. Historically, my parents had treated my bank accounts like a slush fund for Harrison. Every time I had saved money from a high school job or college internship, they had guilted me into surrendering it to bail out Harrison's latest foolish venture. They drained my college fund to pay for his first failed app startup. They begged me to take out personal loans to cover his gambling debts, claiming it was my duty to protect the family name. I learned very quickly that the only way to survive their financial abuse was to play poor. By making them believe I had nothing, I protected everything I had actually built. I logged into my proprietary financial tracking software, typing in a series of complex passcodes. Months ago, when I first moved into the family home to act as my parents' hospice nurse, I had quietly installed highly sophisticated monitoring scripts onto the family business servers. I knew Harrison had power of attorney, and I knew he could not be trusted with a single cent. Now, staring at the glowing screen in the quiet luxury of the penthouse, I had full, unfettered visibility into every single transaction moving through the family estate. A sharp red alert pinged across my screen. The direct conflict was happening in real time. Harrison, clearly panicking because I had frozen the primary estate credit lines, was making an active, aggressive attempt to bypass the block. He was sitting in the very house he had just kicked me out of, trying to route large sums of cash through an obscure third-party vendor account he had quietly linked to the family trust. I watched the numbers flash across the screen. He was attempting to siphon $50,000 to pay his private security team and cover an overdue invoice for his supposedly booming investment firm. I hovered my finger over the trackpad, my eyes narrowing at his sheer audacity. With a single swift click, I engaged a hard block on the routing number. The transaction immediately bounced back as rejected. A moment later, another red ping appeared. Harrison was trying again, this time attempting to split the payment into smaller increments to bypass standard banking flags. He was frantic, pushing through $10,000 requests in rapid succession. I systematically blocked every single one. I sat in the quiet penthouse sipping my water, completely neutralizing my brother's financial power with the casual flick of my wrist. He was trapped, and he had absolutely no idea that the sister he had just thrown out into the rain was the one holding the keys to his cage. But shutting down his immediate cash grab was not enough. I needed to know why he was so desperate for liquid capital on the very day we buried our parents. I opened a new terminal window and initiated a deep forensic trace on the obscure vendor account he had been trying to use. The software rapidly decrypted the routing layers, peeling back the fake corporate identities and dummy addresses Harrison had set up to hide his tracks. The deeper I dug, the more the sickening reality of his operations came into focus. Harrison did not just have a struggling investment firm. He was running a completely fraudulent operation. The ledgers revealed a chaotic, bleeding mess of unpaid debts, empty promises, and ghost investors. And sitting right in the middle of this financial ruin was a glaring, massive anomaly. My software finished tracing the final IP addresses, bringing up a secure offshore banking ledger. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat as the final pieces of data loaded. It was a massive, unauthorized wire transfer. $3.5 million had been completely drained from our parents' primary corporate holding account and sent directly to an untraceable shell company located in the Cayman Islands. I pulled up the digital authorization form attached to the wire transfer. The signature at the bottom of the document was undeniably Harrison's. He had authorized the massive theft himself, using his power of attorney to completely gut the family legacy. But it was not the amount of money or the forged authorization that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was the timestamp on the digital signature. I stared at the bright white numbers glowing against the dark screen, a sickening realization settling heavily into my stomach. Harrison had not initiated this transfer after our parents died. He had not done it during their funeral or even while they were in the hospital. I looked closer at the exact date and time stamped on the Cayman Islands wire transfer. The signature was dated the exact morning our parents died in the crash. Before the police even called us, before anyone supposedly knew they were gone. I leaned back in my leather chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes, as a dangerous, absolute calm washed over me. "You did not just steal from them, Harrison," I whispered to the empty room. "You knew they were not coming back." The biting Chicago wind whipped across the elementary school parking lot the next morning as I pulled my modest sedan into the drop-off lane. I watched my 7-year-old son Leo walk through the heavy glass double doors, his small shoulders hunched against the lingering chill. I took a deep breath, savoring the brief moment of quiet after the chaotic high-stakes revelations of the previous night. I had uncovered Harrison's massive fraudulent wire transfer to the Cayman Islands, and the sheer magnitude of his betrayal was still settling heavily in my chest. The warmth of the car heater blasted against my cold hands as I put the vehicle in reverse, checking my rearview mirror to pull back onto the main street. But before my foot could even touch the gas pedal, a massive black Range Rover swerved violently into the space directly behind me. The heavy SUV jerked to a sudden, aggressive halt, its bumper mere inches from mine, completely blocking my car. I recognized the obnoxious custom license plate immediately. It belonged to Harrison. The driver door flew open and my brother stepped out onto the cold pavement. He was wearing another immaculate tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled looking, as though he had not just spent the previous evening frantically trying to siphon money from a frozen family account. But it was the passenger door opening that made my jaw tighten and my pulse slow to a calculated icy rhythm. His wife, Felicity, stepped out into the crisp morning air, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than a semester of college tuition. She wore a pristine white trench coat and a pair of oversized dark sunglasses, looking down her nose at my sensible car as if it were an infectious disease. They marched toward my window in perfect unison, a united front of blinding entitlement and unchecked greed. I did not panic. I simply put the car in park, unbuckled my seatbelt, and stepped out onto the asphalt to meet them. "What is this, Harrison?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any intimidation. "Are you making a habit of ambushing single mothers in elementary school parking lots now?" Harrison did not waste his time with pleasantries or fake sibling affection. He closed the distance between us, his face flushed with an ugly, arrogant color that betrayed his underlying panic over the frozen accounts. He thrust a thick manila folder directly against my chest, forcing me to grab it or let it drop to the wet ground. I grasped the rough paper, looking down at the legal document clipped inside. It was a formal waiver of rights drafted with convoluted legal jargon that essentially surrendered all claims I might have to our parents' massive estate. "Sign it, Lydia," he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, aggressive whisper, so the passing parents walking their children to the school entrance would not hear his threats. "You are going to sign away your right to contest the estate, your right to the manufacturing business, and your right to ever set foot on the family property again. In exchange for your signature today, I am willing to cut you a pity check for $10,000 right now. It is far more than you deserve, and it is the only cash you are ever going to see from me." I looked at the waiver, my trained eyes instantly scanning the poorly drafted clauses and amateur formatting. It was a desperate, sloppy move. He knew the credit accounts were frozen. He knew something was terribly wrong with his access, and his immediate reaction was to try and bully me into legally silencing myself before the official will reading tomorrow. $10,000, I repeated, looking up at him with a deadpan expression. "You locked my son and me out in the freezing rain yesterday, and now you want to buy my silence for pennies." Felicity scoffed loudly, pushing her oversized sunglasses up into her blonde hair. $10,000 is an absolute fortune for someone like you, Lydia. You should be down on your knees thanking us for this charity. You have always been a leech on this family. You dropped out of law school and expected your mother and father to just fund your pathetic existence. Have you conveniently forgotten how things work in the real world? Do you not remember when they refused to co-sign your student loans because they knew you were a terrible investment? They bought Harrison a new sports car that same week because he actually had a future worth investing in. You are a failure, Lydia. You have always been a failure. Take the money and go crawl back under whatever rock you have been hiding under for the last 10 years. Her vicious words were meant to cut deep a deliberate, cruel weaponization of the blatant favoritism that had defined my entire childhood. They truly believed I was still that same 22-year-old girl begging for emotional scraps while they feasted on the family wealth. Harrison stepped closer, invading my personal space. His imposing figure meant to physically intimidate me into submission. The fake, charming smile he showed the world was completely gone, replaced by a vicious, threatening sneer. "Sign the paper, Lydia. I know you are broke. I know you do not have the money to hire a lawyer to fight me in court. If you do not sign this waiver right now, I am going to make your life a living hell. I will call Child Protective Services this afternoon. I will tell them you are a homeless, unstable dropout who is unfit to raise a child. I will have Leo taken away from you and placed in the system before the weekend. Do not test me. I will bury you." The vile threat against my innocent son hung heavily in the cold morning air. A lesser woman would have slapped him across the face. A lesser woman would have screamed, cried, or begged for mercy to protect her child. I did none of those things. I simply maintained unbroken, piercing eye contact with my brother, letting the absolute crushing silence stretch between us until his arrogant sneer began to falter into a state of slight, uncomfortable confusion. Slowly, deliberately, I opened my sensible black purse. I reached past my encrypted work phone and pulled out a heavy, expensive red fountain pen. I unclipped the thick stack of papers from the manila folder. Using the hood of my car as a makeshift desk, I flipped directly to the second page of his pathetic, legally flawed waiver. I uncapped the pen and drew a massive red circle around a glaring formatting error in the primary liability clause. I then rapidly signed a false, illegible squiggle on a blank piece of printer paper I had smoothly slipped from my own notebook, tucked the original legal waiver seamlessly into the deep pocket of my wool coat, and handed the manila folder back to him with the useless fake signature page inside. "Your lawyer used the wrong jurisdiction code in Section 4. Harrison," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, ringing with icy authority. "If you are going to try and extort a family member in broad daylight, at least hire competent legal counsel to draft the paperwork. Now step away from my vehicle and get away from my son's school before I call the local authorities and have you arrested for criminal harassment." Harrison snatched the folder back from my hands with a forceful jerk, completely blinded by his own rage and not bothering to check the actual pages hidden inside. He laughed, a loud barking sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance that echoed across the nearly empty parking lot. "You are so incredibly arrogant for someone who has absolutely nothing to her name," he mocked, turning his back on me and walking toward his expensive luxury SUV. "Enjoy sleeping in the back of your cheap car tonight, Lydia. I am going to completely wipe you off the map at the official will reading tomorrow morning. Mr. Caldwell is going to hand me the keys to the entire corporate kingdom, and you are going to sit there and watch me take every last dime." Felicity shot me one last look of utter venomous disgust before climbing gracefully into the passenger seat and slamming the heavy door shut. I stood perfectly still in the parking lot and watched as Harrison slammed his vehicle into gear, the heavy tires screeching loudly against the asphalt as he sped away, entirely confident he had just successfully secured his fraudulent, crumbling empire. Once their dark vehicle disappeared around the corner of the brick school building, I reached into the deep pocket of my coat and slowly pulled out the original uncreased legal document he had tried to force me to sign under duress. I looked down at the crisp physical evidence of his desperate, highly illegal intimidation tactic. "Perfect," I whispered to the empty, quiet parking lot, a cold, calculated smile finally touching my lips as the pieces of my trap fell into place. Proof of extortion. The drive back from Leo's elementary school was a blur of cold Chicago traffic. I kept the heater blasting, letting the rhythmic hum of the tires ground me against the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The original waiver Harrison had shoved at my chest was tucked safely in the glove compartment, a physical manifestation of his towering arrogance. He thought he was playing a grand game of chess, but he was barely flipping checkers on a board he did not even understand. Once I handed my keys to the valet at the downtown plaza and rode the private glass-walled elevator up to my penthouse, my entire demeanor shifted. I shed the heavy wool coat and the persona of the cornered single mother. I was entirely in my element now. The heavy mahogany desk in the sprawling living room became my central war room. I opened my encrypted laptop, the high-definition screen illuminating the dim room, and plugged in the secure solid-state drive containing my proprietary financial tracking software. The Cayman Islands shell company I had identified yesterday was the loose thread, and I was about to pull it until Harrison's entire custom-tailored sweater unraveled completely. I poured a tall glass of black coffee, cracked my knuckles, and initiated a full-scale forensic audit of Harrison's supposedly booming investment firm. He always bragged about his vast portfolio, flashing his fake wealth at every Thanksgiving dinner, making sure everyone in the extended family knew he was the absolute financial savior of our bloodline. It was finally time to see exactly what he was saving. I routed my connection through a secure proxy server, perfectly masking my digital footprint, and fed the Cayman routing numbers directly into my completely automated tracking software. The initial scan hit a massive roadblock almost immediately. Harrison had not been completely foolish. He had hired someone highly skilled to build a digital fortress around the core financial servers of his investment firm. A series of aggressive encrypted firewalls slammed down, actively blocking my software from accessing the primary ledgers. Bright red warning banners flashed across my screen, indicating that his IT team was actively monitoring incoming traffic and attempting to trace my location. It was an incredibly sophisticated setup designed specifically to keep nosy private investors and government regulatory agencies completely blind to the actual daily cash flow. But a firewall is only as strong as the architect who built it, and I successfully dismantled corporate fortresses for a living. I did not try to bash the front door down with brute force algorithms. Instead, I intelligently pivoted my approach. I targeted the shared, legacy servers connecting his flashy investment firm to our parents' traditional decades-old manufacturing business. Harrison had foolishly tied the two entities together to give himself a permanent veneer of corporate legitimacy. That arrogant connection was his fatal flaw. Using a hidden backdoor entry designed for outdated payroll software, I slipped right past his expensive state-of-the-art security protocols. The digital transition was completely silent. No alarms triggered, no red banners flashed. I was deep inside the mainframe. I began pulling down massive packets of data, expertly organizing thousands of raw financial records into clean, readable spreadsheets. The heavy download took exactly 12 minutes. During that tense time, the only sound in the penthouse was the soft, rapid clicking of my keyboard. When the final encrypted file transferred, I opened the master ledger. I expected to find casual embezzlement. I expected to find severe corporate mismanagement. What I actually found was a staggering tragedy of blind enabling that made my chest physically ache. The stark black and white numbers stared back at me, telling a heartbreaking story of decades of financial abuse. Harrison's investment firm had never been successful. It had never generated a single honest dollar of actual profit. Every luxurious overseas vacation he took, every custom Italian suit he bought, and every massive executive bonus he paid himself came directly from our parents' pockets. I scrolled through the historical ledgers, my eyes rapidly scanning the devastating truth. Whenever Harrison's risky investments crashed, my parents quietly bailed him out without hesitation. There was a direct transfer for $300,000, marked simply as a business loan, dated the exact week my parents had told me they could not afford to co-sign my modest student loans. There was another massive transfer for $500,000 flagged internally by the accountant to cover Harrison's catastrophic losses at a private high-stakes casino in Macau. My parents had systematically starved their own legitimate manufacturing business to keep Harrison's grand illusion alive. They abruptly canceled crucial equipment upgrades. They permanently froze dedicated employee wages. They completely drained their own private retirement accounts just to continually fund his absolute failures. He was a black hole of debt, and they had willingly thrown their entire legacy into it just to protect their precious golden boy. The lingering resentment I had carried for years suddenly felt incredibly heavy and deeply validated. I had spent my entire youth desperately trying to earn their respect, working multiple grueling jobs to pay for my education, meticulously building my corporate restructuring firm from nothing. They had looked at my hard work and dismissively called it a cute hobby while they watched Harrison burn millions and publicly called him a financial genius. I forcefully pushed the bitter memories aside. Emotion had absolutely no place in a forensic audit. I needed to keep following the money trail. I meticulously cross-referenced the dates of the parental bailouts with the current operating capital of his firm. The mathematical reality was completely brutal. The Cayman Islands transfer I found yesterday was not just a greedy, opportunistic cash grab. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to hide the last remaining drops of liquidity from his creditors. Harrison's firm was not just struggling to stay afloat. It was a massive structural Ponzi scheme, and it was entirely hopelessly bankrupt. He had been illegally using new investor money to pay off the furious old investors, all while blatantly skimming millions off the top to fund his lavish lifestyle. But the pool of gullible new investors had clearly dried up months ago. The ledgers showed catastrophic negative balances across the board. He owed tens of millions of dollars to very dangerous, unforgiving people. I dug much deeper, bypassing the corporate files and directly accessing the municipal property records tied to the family estate. If Harrison was this deep in the red, he would have desperately looked for any available collateral to keep himself out of prison. I pulled up the official deed history for the sprawling Chicago mansion. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Harrison had not just drained the liquid cash accounts, he had leveraged the very ground our parents lived on. Over the past 3 years, he had secretly taken out 4 massive secondary mortgages on the primary family estate. The legal documents attached to the risky loans were digitally signed by my father. I zoomed in tightly on the electronic signatures, running a visual comparison to the authentic legal documents I possessed in my physical files. The discrepancy was immediately glaring. Harrison had blatantly forged our father's signature on every single mortgage application. He had unlawfully used his limited power of attorney to bypass the strict bank verifications, stealing the multi-million-dollar house right out from under our parents while they were still alive. I immediately reviewed the strict repayment schedules attached to the fraudulent secondary mortgages. Harrison had completely defaulted on every single one. He had not made a single required monthly payment in over 9 agonizing months. The holding bank had sent multiple urgent default notices, all of which Harrison had successfully intercepted and cowardly hidden from our trusting parents. I ran a quick, precise calculation on the final legal grace period established by the lending institution. The numbers locked into place perfectly on my screen, and a cold, breathtaking wave of realization washed completely over me. The final default notice had officially expired last week, while my parents were unconscious in the hospital. I looked intently at the digital calendar on my screen, carefully counting the specific days allowed under strict Illinois foreclosure law. The bank was not just going to send another polite warning letter in the mail. They were actively mobilizing their legal team to forcibly reclaim the massive collateral. Harrison truly thought he had secured a massive fortune by locking me out of the house in the rain. He genuinely thought he was moving his arrogant wife into a permanent palace of generational wealth. He had absolutely no idea that the bank was legally scheduled to brutally foreclose on the property and completely seize the entire estate in less than 48 hours. He did not own a mansion. He owned a ticking time bomb, and he was blindly standing right at ground zero. The soft glow of my laptop screen illuminated the dark penthouse living room as the reality of Harrison's impending doom settled over me. He had built a fragile house of cards on top of a highly explosive foundation, and the timer was rapidly ticking down to zero. The bank was coming for the estate. My parents' grand home, the symbol of our family wealth, was already gone. But before I could even process the sheer magnitude of his financial incompetence, a sharp chime broke the silence of the room. A new email notification slid across the upper right corner of my screen. The sender was Harrison. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the recipient list. He had copied the entire extended family again, making sure every aunt, uncle, and cousin was a witness to his latest power play. The subject line simply read, "Warehouse access revoked." I clicked into the body of the email, reading the arrogant words he had undoubtedly typed with a smug smile on his face. He formally barred me from entering the grounds of the family manufacturing warehouse, effectively cutting me off from the only legitimate business our parents had actually built. He claimed that due to my recent erratic behavior and the supposed theft of our mother's jewelry, he was forced to take drastic protective measures. He boasted that he had dispatched his private security team to the warehouse facility to physically change every single lock on the exterior doors and the interior administrative offices. He instructed the family to ignore any desperate pleas for help I might send their way, claiming he was handling my mental breakdown with the utmost legal care. He was trying to completely isolate me to shut me out of the last remaining asset before the official will reading tomorrow morning. He thought changing physical locks would stop me. He clearly did not understand that physical locks were entirely useless against someone who already held the digital master keys. I did not waste a single second reading the replies that immediately began flooding in from my sycophantic relatives praising his firm leadership. I closed the email application and instantly pivoted my attack vector. If Harrison was currently changing the physical locks at the warehouse, his overpriced IT guy would undoubtedly be initiating a total lockdown of the internal administrative servers next. I had a very narrow window of opportunity to extract whatever remaining assets and data were left inside the manufacturing database before they severed my backdoor access completely. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard security gateways and plunging directly into the warehouse administrative network. The server was old, bloated with decades of disorganized company data and outdated employee records. I initiated a massive scraping protocol commanding my software to rapidly download every single financial ledger, vendor contract, and internal communication logs stored on the hard drive. I watched the progress bar inch forward, knowing Harrison's IT guy could manually cut the remote connection at any moment. The digital transfer moved with agonizing slowness. As the software meticulously ripped through the hidden directories and buried administrative folders, a strange anomaly caught my eye. It was not a financial ledger or a basic text document. It was a massive, heavily encrypted file buried deep within a system folder, labeled with a string of random characters. The file path bypassed the standard company directory, completely sitting isolated in a sector of the server that had not been actively accessed in 3 months. My software automatically flagged it as a password-protected video file. I paused the main data extraction and focused my entire system on isolating that single anomaly. Harrison lacked the technical skill to hide a file this cleanly, and his IT guy would never bury a simple company video under military-grade encryption. Someone else had put it there, someone who desperately wanted it hidden from Harrison. I ran a rapid decryption sequence, throwing a barrage of brute force algorithms at the password barrier. It took less than 2 minutes for the digital lock to shatter. I extracted the file, routing it securely to my local hard drive, and clicked play. The screen flickered black for a fraction of a second before resolving into a grainy, dimly lit video. I stared at the screen, my breath catching sharply in my throat. It was my mother. She was sitting at the heavy oak desk in our family library, the very room Harrison had just kicked me out of. But she did not look like the composed, authoritative woman who had spent my entire life judging my every move. She looked completely exhausted. Dark, heavy circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin possessed a pale, sickly pallor. The timestamp in the lower corner of the video indicated it had been recorded exactly 3 months before the fatal car accident. It was right around the time she had first started complaining about feeling unwell, right before I had moved back into the estate to care for her. "Lydia," she said, her voice trembling slightly, sounding fragile and incredibly tired. "If you are watching this, it means I am gone, and it means you were smart enough to look where Harrison would never think to search." I sat perfectly still in the quiet penthouse, the distant sounds of Chicago traffic completely fading away as her voice filled the room. "I need to tell you the truth," she continued, folding her trembling hands tightly together on the desk. "I need to tell you what I have done. 3 months ago, I noticed discrepancies in the estate accounts. Small things at first. Missing statements, unexplained withdrawals that Harrison swore were just accounting errors. But he was lying. I did not want to believe it, but I could not ignore the missing money anymore. I secretly hired an independent outside auditor to review the investment firm and the family trust. I did not tell your father. I did not tell anyone." She paused, taking a shaky breath and looking down at her hands. "The auditor gave me his final report last week. Harrison has been bleeding us dry, Lydia. He has stolen millions. His firm is completely bankrupt, and he has been desperately covering it up by draining our manufacturing accounts and leveraging the estate. He is going to destroy everything your grandfather built." A tear slipped down her pale cheek, and she hastily wiped it away with the back of her hand. "We enabled him, Lydia. Your father and I enabled him every single step of the way. We wanted so badly for him to be the successful son, the brilliant heir, that we willingly blinded ourselves to his absolute incompetence. We bailed him out time and time again, and we starved the actual family business to do it." She looked directly into the camera, her gaze piercing through the digital noise and finding me in the dark penthouse. "I was wrong, Lydia. I was so incredibly wrong to push you away. I treated you terribly because I resented your independence. I resented that you did not need my money or my approval to build your life. You were strong and capable, and I punished you for it while I rewarded his weakness. I am so deeply, deeply sorry." I watched the screen with quiet, absolute stoicism. My chest felt incredibly tight, a heavy pressure bearing down on my ribs. But I did not cry. I did not break down or scream at the unfairness of it all. I simply sat there and absorbed the words I had waited my entire adult life to hear. It was the ultimate validation of everything I had endured. She finally saw me. She finally recognized my strength and admitted her own devastating failures. But her apology, while profoundly meaningful, did not change the reality of the impending war. I did not share the video. I did not immediately forward it to the extended family to clear my name. I calmly archived the file, locking it securely into my encrypted digital vault. It was not just an apology, it was pure, unadulterated ammunition. My mother took another deep breath, squaring her fragile shoulders and sitting up straighter. The tears were gone, replaced by a sudden fierce determination that I immediately recognized as my own. "I could not let him take it all, Lydia," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent register. "I could not let him destroy the only real legacy this family has left. The manufacturing business, the patents, the original factory deeds, I have removed them completely from his reach. I took drastic legal action to protect the true family legacy." She leaned closer to the camera, her eyes intense. "Go to the specific lockbox at the downtown bank. Harrison thinks he is taking it all. Do not let him." The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my own dark reflection. A cold smile touched my lips. "Perfect," I whispered quietly. The soft glow of my laptop screen illuminated the dark penthouse living room as the reality of Harrison's impending doom settled over me. He had built a fragile house of cards on top of a highly explosive foundation, and the timer was rapidly ticking down to zero. The bank was coming for the estate. My parents' grand home, the symbol of our family wealth, was already gone. But before I could even process the sheer magnitude of his financial incompetence, a sharp chime broke the silence of the room. A new email notification slid across the upper right corner of my screen. The sender was Harrison. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the recipient list. He had copied the entire extended family again, making sure every aunt, uncle, and cousin was a witness to his latest power play. The subject line simply read, "Warehouse access revoked." I clicked into the body of the email, reading the arrogant words he had undoubtedly typed with a smug smile on his face. He formally barred me from entering the grounds of the family manufacturing warehouse, effectively cutting me off from the only legitimate business our parents had actually built. He claimed that due to my recent erratic behavior and the supposed theft of our mother's jewelry, he was forced to take drastic protective measures. He boasted that he had dispatched his private security team to the warehouse facility to physically change every single lock on the exterior doors and the interior administrative offices. He instructed the family to ignore any desperate pleas for help I might send their way, claiming he was handling my mental breakdown with the utmost legal care. He was trying to completely isolate me to shut me out of the last remaining asset before the official will reading tomorrow morning. He thought changing physical locks would stop me. He clearly did not understand that physical locks were entirely useless against someone who already held the digital master keys. I did not waste a single second reading the replies that immediately began flooding in from my sycophantic relatives praising his firm leadership. I closed the email application and instantly pivoted my attack vector. If Harrison was currently changing the physical locks at the warehouse, his overpriced IT guy would undoubtedly be initiating a total lockdown of the internal administrative servers next. I had a very narrow window of opportunity to extract whatever remaining assets and data were left inside the manufacturing database before they severed my backdoor access completely. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard security gateways and plunging directly into the warehouse administrative network. The server was old, bloated with decades of disorganized company data and outdated employee records. I initiated a massive scraping protocol, commanding my software to rapidly download every single financial ledger, vendor contract, and internal communication log stored on the hard drive. I watched the progress bar inch forward, knowing Harrison's IT guy could manually cut the remote connection at any moment. The digital transfer moved with agonizing slowness. As the software meticulously ripped through the hidden directories and buried administrative folders, a strange anomaly caught my eye. It was not a financial ledger or a basic text document. It was a massive, heavily encrypted file buried deep within a system folder labeled with a string of random characters. The file path bypassed the standard company directory, completely sitting isolated in a sector of the server that had not been actively accessed in 3 months. My software automatically flagged it as a password-protected video file. I paused the main data extraction and focused my entire system on isolating that single anomaly. Harrison lacked the technical skill to hide a file this cleanly, and his IT guy would never bury a simple company video under military-grade encryption. Someone else had put it there. Someone who desperately wanted it hidden from Harrison. I ran a rapid decryption sequence, throwing a barrage of brute force algorithms at the password barrier. It took less than 2 minutes for the digital lock to shatter. I extracted the file, routing it securely to my local hard drive, and clicked play. The screen flickered black for a fraction of a second before resolving into a grainy, dimly lit video. I stared at the screen, my breath catching sharply in my throat. It was my mother. She was sitting at the heavy oak desk in our family library, the very room Harrison had just kicked me out of. But she did not look like the composed, authoritative woman who had spent my entire life judging my every move. She looked completely exhausted. Dark, heavy circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin possessed a pale, sickly pallor. The timestamp in the lower corner of the video indicated it had been recorded exactly 3 months before the fatal car accident. It was right around the time she had first started complaining about feeling unwell, right before I had moved back into the estate to care for her. "Lydia," she said, her voice trembling slightly, sounding fragile and incredibly tired. "If you are watching this, it means I am gone, and it means you were smart enough to look where Harrison would never think to search." I sat perfectly still in the quiet penthouse, the distant sounds of Chicago traffic completely fading away as her voice filled the room. "I need to tell you the truth," She continued, folding her trembling hands tightly together on the desk. I need to tell you what I have done. 3 months ago, I noticed discrepancies in the estate accounts. Small things at first, missing statements, unexplained withdrawals that Harrison swore were just accounting errors. But he was lying. I did not want to believe it, but I could not ignore the missing money anymore. I secretly hired an independent outside auditor to review the investment firm and the family trust. I did not tell your father. I did not tell anyone. She paused, taking a shaky breath and looking down at her hands. The auditor gave me his final report last week. Harrison has been bleeding us dry, Lydia. He has stolen millions. His firm is completely bankrupt, and he has been desperately covering it up by draining our manufacturing accounts and leveraging the estate. He is going to destroy everything your grandfather built. A tear slipped down her pale cheek and she hastily wiped it away with the back of her hand. We enabled him, Lydia. Your father and I enabled him every single step of the way. We wanted so badly for him to be the successful son, the brilliant heir, that we willingly blinded ourselves to his absolute incompetence. We bailed him out time and time again, and we starved the actual family business to do it. She looked directly into the camera, her gaze piercing through the digital noise and finding me in the dark penthouse. I was wrong, Lydia. I was so incredibly wrong to push you away. I treated you terribly because I resented your independence. I resented that you did not need my money or my approval to build your life. You were strong and capable, and I punished you for it while I rewarded his weakness. I am so deeply, deeply sorry. I watched the screen with quiet, absolute stoicism. My chest felt incredibly tight, a heavy pressure bearing down on my ribs, but I did not cry. I did not break down or scream at the unfairness of it all. I simply sat there and absorbed the words I had waited my entire adult life to hear. It was the ultimate validation of everything I had endured. She finally saw me. She finally recognized my strength and admitted her own devastating failures. But her apology, while profoundly meaningful, did not change the reality of the impending war. I did not share the video. I did not immediately forward it to the extended family to clear my name. I calmly archived the file, locking it securely into my encrypted digital vault. It was not just an apology. It was pure, unadulterated ammunition. My mother took another deep breath, squaring her fragile shoulders and sitting up straighter. The tears were gone, replaced by a sudden, fierce determination that I immediately recognized as my own. I could not let him take it all. Lydia, she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent register. I could not let him destroy the only real legacy this family has left. The manufacturing business, the patents, the original factory deeds, I have removed them completely from his reach. I took drastic legal action to protect the true family legacy. She leaned closer to the camera, her eyes intense. Go to the specific lockbox at the downtown bank. Harrison thinks he is taking it all. Do not let him. The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my own dark reflection. A cold smile touched my lips. Perfect, I whispered quietly. I closed the encrypted laptop, the satisfying mechanical click echoing sharply in the cavernous, quiet expanse of the luxury penthouse. My mother had finally handed me the loaded weapon I desperately needed. I stood up from the heavy mahogany desk, smoothing the front of my tailored black trousers, my mind operating with absolute clinical precision. There was absolutely no time to waste. The bank opened in 20 minutes, and if Harrison was as panicked as his fraudulent ledgers suggested, he would already be tearing the city apart, trying to find any remaining liquid assets to save his sinking ship. I grabbed my structured leather briefcase, slipped the heavy, archaic brass key I had received in a blank envelope a week ago into my pocket, and headed straight for the private elevator. The morning traffic in downtown Chicago was a snarled, chaotic mess of yellow taxis and delivery trucks. I navigated my sensible sedan through the towering steel canyons of the financial district, the icy rain slicking the pavement and matching the cold determination settling in my chest. For years, I had allowed my family to believe I was a complete failure. I had absorbed their endless mockery and their thinly veiled disgust to protect the fortune I was building in secret. My mother's recorded confession was the final devastating piece of the puzzle, the absolute proof that my strategic silence had not been in vain. She had finally seen the truth about Harrison. She had finally understood that giving him unchecked power was a death sentence for the family legacy. I pulled into a secure parking garage 2 blocks from First Continental Trust, a towering historic bank that catered exclusively to generational wealth and elite corporate accounts. The wind was frigid as I walked toward the grand entrance, but I did not feel the cold. I felt entirely invincible. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling marble-lined lobby of the bank. The institution was designed to intimidate, featuring massive vaulted ceilings adorned with intricate gold leaf and thick stone pillars that echoed every footstep. But today, the usual hushed, reverent silence of high finance was being completely shattered by a very familiar grating voice. "I do not care about your internal protocols," Harrison bellowed. His face was an ugly, mottled shade of red, and a thick vein pulsed dangerously at his temple. He was leaning aggressively over the polished mahogany desk of a senior bank manager, violently slapping a thick stack of legal papers against the wood. "I am the sole executor of the Vance estate. I hold complete, irrevocable power of attorney. My parents are dead, and I demand immediate access to their secure vault right this second." The bank manager, a balding man in a conservative gray suit, looked visibly shaken. He was sweating profusely, trying desperately to placate a man who was clearly accustomed to bullying his way through life. "Sir, I understand your frustration," the manager stammered, holding up his hands in a defensive, pleading gesture. "But as I have explained 3 times, this specific lockbox is not registered under the primary estate trust. Your general power of attorney simply does not grant you access to this particular vault unit." Harrison let out a furious roar of frustration, turning abruptly away from the desk to pace the marble floor like a caged animal. That was when his wild, panicked eyes locked directly onto me. He froze, his aggressive pacing coming to a dead halt. The shock on his face instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, positioning his massive frame to physically block my path to the administrative desk. "What the hell are you doing here, Lydia?" he hissed, his voice echoing loudly across the stunned lobby. "You have absolutely no business in this bank. Are you seriously trying to steal my inheritance right in front of me?" I stopped walking, maintaining a perfectly calm, polite distance from his aggressive posture. "I am here to conduct private banking business, Harrison. Kindly step aside and lower your voice." He barked out a harsh, mocking laugh, turning to the frightened bank manager and pointing a rigid, accusing finger directly at my chest. "Do you see this woman? This is my unstable dropout sister. She has been a financial leech on our family for her entire pathetic life. She failed out of law school, she has no career, and she has survived purely on my parents' misplaced charity. And now that they are dead, she is trying to rob the estate blind." He stepped closer to me, his expensive cologne failing to mask the sour scent of his rising panic. "You are not getting a single dime, Lydia. I know you stole Mom's vintage jewelry yesterday. I know you tried to hack into the primary accounts last night before I locked you out. You are a common thief. You think because you changed their adult diapers for 6 months, you are entitled to half of my company. I built that manufacturing empire. Dad promised it to me." He was projecting his own fraudulent crimes onto me, using his loud, aggressive posturing to intimidate the bank staff into bypassing their strict security protocols. It was the exact same tactic he had used to manipulate our parents his entire life. He shouted louder than everyone else until they simply gave in to keep the peace. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw 2 armed security guards edging closer, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts, unsure of how to handle a wealthy client throwing a massive public tantrum. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, chaotic energy. I simply stepped neatly around his blocking stance, ignoring his towering presence, and approached the sweating bank manager. "Good morning," I said, my voice crisp, professional, and radiating absolute authority. "My name is Lydia Vance. I believe you are currently experiencing some confusion regarding lockbox 742. Do not listen to a single word she says, Harrison yelled, slamming his fist on the desk again, rattling the expensive pen holder. She has no authority here. I have the legal documentation. I ignored him completely. I opened my leather briefcase and smoothly extracted a heavy, embossed legal folder. I had spent the early hours of the morning coordinating with my elite legal team, utilizing the encrypted video confession my mother had left me to secure immediate legal backing. I placed a freshly verified, fully expedited court injunction directly in front of the manager. Right beside it, I placed the heavy, archaic brass key I had pulled from my pocket. The manager adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he read the emergency court order. The legal phrasing was ruthless, precise, and completely indisputable. As you can see from the certified injunction, I said, maintaining steady, unnerving eye contact with the manager, the lockbox in question was opened by my mother 3 months ago under an entirely separate private legal entity. My brother's power of attorney covers the primary family trust. It does not, however, cover the independent limited liability company my mother formed. Furthermore, the documents clearly state that I am the sole exclusive signatory authorized to access that vault. Harrison Vance has absolutely no legal jurisdiction here. Harrison snatched the document from the desk, his eyes frantically scanning the heavy legal text. His jaw dropped, the color completely drained from his flushed face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small. "This is a forgery," he stammered, his voice losing its booming resonance. "This is impossible. Mom would never do this. She would never give you control over anything. You forged this document." I turned to face him, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to finally break across my face. "She did not just give me control, Harrison. She finally saw you for exactly what you are. She secretly hired an outside auditor. She knew your investment firm was a bankrupt Ponzi scheme. She knew you were leveraging the family estate to cover your illegal gambling debts. And she knew you were going to destroy the only real business this family had left." He dropped the paper as if it had caught fire. He took a stumbling step backward, his chest heaving as the reality of his absolute ruin finally breached his massive ego. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated panic. "No, I am the executor. I am the rightful heir. You cannot do this to me." I looked past my brother, catching the eye of the lead security guard. "This man is trespassing on my private banking appointment and actively attempting to intercept secure financial documents," I said, my tone completely deadpan. "Please remove him from the premises immediately." The guards did not hesitate. They grabbed Harrison by both arms. He fought them, twisting and thrashing like a cornered animal, foaming at the mouth as he screamed obscenities at me. "I will destroy you, Lydia. I will tie you up in court for the rest of your miserable life. You are a dead woman." His desperate threats echoed through the grand marble lobby, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings as the guards forcibly dragged his thrashing expensive suit out through the heavy revolving doors and into the freezing street. The bank manager wiped his brow with a silk handkerchief, letting out a long, shaky breath. "My sincere apologies, Ms. Vance," he said, his tone entirely transformed into one of deep, respectful deference. "Right this way, please." He led me away from the chaotic lobby, guiding me through a series of heavy steel doors and high-tech biometric scanners. We descended into the silent, climate-controlled belly of the bank. The air smelled of old paper and polished metal. We stopped in front of a massive wall of secure deposit boxes. He used his master key to engage the primary lock on box 742, and I slid my heavy brass key into the secondary slot. I turned it, feeling the satisfying heavy mechanical click of the internal mechanism. The manager stepped back, bowing slightly to give me absolute privacy. I pulled the long metal drawer from the wall and carried it to a private viewing table in the center of the secure room. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside, resting quietly on top of a thick stack of original factory deeds, was a single heavy envelope bearing my name. I opened it and pulled out a stack of crisp, legally binding documents. It was a formal, irrevocable codicil to my parents' original will, drafted by an elite, out-of-state law firm Harrison had never heard of. I read the dense legal text, my heart pounding a fierce, victorious rhythm against my ribs. My mother had executed a brilliant, ruthless corporate maneuver right under his nose. She knew Harrison would assume he inherited the entire manufacturing empire based on the original estate plan, but 3 months ago, she had secretly separated the physical manufacturing company from its immensely valuable intellectual property and the sprawling commercial land it sat on. Harrison was going to inherit the shell of the corporation tomorrow morning. He was going to inherit the aging machinery, the massive operating debts, and the crushing payroll liabilities. But he did not own the land beneath the factories, and he did not own the patents that made the products valuable. My mother had legally deeded the commercial real estate and the intellectual property entirely to me. I ran my fingers over my mother's authentic signature at the bottom of the page, feeling a profound sense of closure. Harrison thinks he is taking it all. Don't let him. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of a live jazz band echoed down the oak-lined street, completely shattering the usual dignified silence of our affluent suburban neighborhood. I parked my modest sedan half a block away from the sprawling Vance family estate, watching the ridiculous spectacle unfold from a safe distance. Harrison had not even waited for the ink to dry on the official probate documents. The formal reading of our parents' will was scheduled for tomorrow morning, yet he was already throwing a massive catered victory party on the manicured front lawn. A fleet of luxury vehicles, gleaming Bentleys, imported sports cars, and heavy armored SUVs choked the long circular driveway. Valets in crisp white shirts sprinted frantically back and forth, tossing keys and barking orders. Harrison had invited the entire extended family, ensuring every sycophantic aunt and uncle was present to witness his grand coronation. More importantly, he had invited his investors. I recognized several of the men standing near the outdoor bar, their sharp suits and nervous, calculating eyes giving them away. These were the shady, dangerous creditors he had been frantically dodging for months, the men who were demanding their money back from his collapsing Ponzi scheme. Harrison was using our parents' stolen estate to put on a desperate theatrical performance, trying to convince these ruthless men that he was flush with fresh generational wealth. He had deliberately excluded me from the guest list, assuming I would spend the evening weeping in my downtown penthouse over the loss of my inheritance. He was remarkably terrible at predicting my behavior. I stepped out of my car, the evening air crisp and cool against my face. I was not alone. Flanking me were two broad-shouldered men wearing identical humorless expressions and sharply tailored municipal suits. Mr. Sterling and Mr. Hayes represented the highest level of the City Zoning and Building Commission, and they were not here to enjoy the champagne. We walked together down the tree-lined sidewalk, our footsteps falling in unison against the pavement. As we approached the towering wrought iron gates of the estate, a private security guard stepped forward, raising his hand to block our path. Before the guard could even open his mouth to demand an invitation, Mr. Sterling flashed a solid gold municipal badge that instantly made the guard step back in silent submission. We walked right through the open gates and onto the expansive front lawn. It did not take long for Harrison to spot me. He was standing on the elevated stone patio, holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne, holding court surrounded by a tight circle of his aggressive investors and our fawning relatives. The moment his eyes locked onto my approaching figure, his loud, booming laugh abruptly cut off. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He handed his champagne flute to a passing waiter and marched down the wide stone steps, cutting a path directly through the manicured grass toward me. The crowd of relatives and investors naturally trailed behind him, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, and eager to witness a public family spectacle. "Look who finally decided to show up," Harrison bellowed, his voice carrying easily over the live music. His face was flushed with alcohol and unearned triumph. He threw his arms wide open in a mock gesture of welcome, gesturing to the sprawling mansion behind him. "Did you get hungry, Lydia? Did you come begging for a plate of catered food? I told security to keep the local strays out, but I suppose they felt sorry for you." A few of our aunts and uncles tittered nervously, exchanging gleeful, malicious whispers. The shady investors watched me with cold, evaluating stares, trying to figure out how I fit into Harrison's grand illusion of wealth. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood my ground on the paved walkway, my posture perfectly straight, letting his childish insults wash over me without leaving a single mark. "You are trespassing, Lydia," he continued, stepping dangerously close to my personal space, his expensive cologne failing to mask the sharp tang of his nervous sweat. "This is my property now. Tomorrow morning the lawyers are going to hand me the absolute keys to the kingdom. I am already drawing up the architectural plans to fix this outdated monstrosity." He turned to his investors, his voice growing even louder, desperately pitching his grand vision to the men he owed millions. "I am completely gutting the West Wing. We are putting in a 2-story glass conservatory, a subterranean wine cellar, and completely remodeling the entire front facade. It is going to be a multi-million-dollar renovation project. The structural contractors are starting the massive demolition work next week. This house is going to be the absolute crown jewel of my personal real estate portfolio." He turned his smug, flushed face back to me, smiling with all of his perfectly capped teeth. "So take a really good look, little sister. Because this is the absolute last time you will ever set foot on this property. Now turn around and walk away before I have you physically thrown out into the street like the trash you are." I maintained my absolute stoicism, refusing to give him the emotional reaction he so desperately craved. I looked past him, locking eyes with his most aggressive investor, a man whose face was tight with barely concealed rage regarding his missing funds. Then I calmly turned my attention back to my brother. "I am not here for your party, Harrison," I said, my voice cutting through the damp evening air with quiet, devastating precision. "And I am certainly not here to beg you for anything. I am here to facilitate a legal municipal intervention." I took a deliberate step to the side, gesturing smoothly to the 2 silent, imposing men standing right behind me. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Sterling and Mr. Hayes. They are senior directors from the City Zoning and Structural Commission." Harrison scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "I do not care who they are. I do not have time for municipal bureaucrats. Tell them to make an appointment with my administrative assistant next month." Mr. Sterling stepped forward, his expression completely devoid of any sympathy. He pulled a thick red folder from his leather briefcase and held it out toward Harrison. "There will be no appointments, Mr. Vance. This is an immediate, non-negotiable municipal action." Harrison frowned, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he stared at the red folder. "What the hell is this?" "That is a formal immediate notice of severe structural condemnation," I explained calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level so that every single relative and investor gathered on the lawn could hear every word. "As you know, you secretly took out 4 massive illegal secondary mortgages on this estate, using our father's forged signature. You completely defaulted on every single one of those fraudulent loans. What you apparently did not realize, Harrison, is that when a property of this historic age and massive square footage goes into catastrophic default, the lending banks immediately trigger a mandatory municipal structural audit to protect their seized collateral." Harrison's face drained of all color. His jaw went slack and his eyes darted frantically toward his investors, who were suddenly standing very rigid, their expressions turning thunderous. "The municipal audit was completed this afternoon." I continued my words, striking him like physical blows. "The structural engineers discovered that the foundation under the West Wing, the exact wing you just bragged about renovating, is completely compromised. It is actively sinking. The electrical wiring throughout the entire 3rd floor is dangerously outdated and poses an immediate catastrophic fire hazard. Because you drained the estate accounts to fund your lavish lifestyle and your completely bankrupt Ponzi scheme, the basic essential maintenance on this property has been neglected for over 3 years." "That is a lie," Harrison sputtered, his voice cracking, a thin line of spittle forming at the corner of his mouth. He looked frantically at the aunts and uncles who were suddenly backing away from him in sheer horror. "I have the money. The business is thriving. I am completely liquid." Mr. Hayes stepped forward, handing a bright red, heavy cardstock notice directly into Harrison's trembling hands. "The property has officially been declared legally uninhabitable and structurally condemned by the city," Mr. Hayes stated with absolute municipal authority. "This entire estate is now an active hazardous safety zone." By order of the City Commission, this gathering constitutes an illegal assembly on a condemned property. Harrison stared at the bright red tag in his hands, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked completely unhinged. "You cannot do this," he screamed, crumbling the red notice in his fist. "You cannot shut down my party. I am Harrison Vance. I own this town." "Actually, the holding bank owns this property now," I corrected him smoothly. "And the city has just shut it down." Mr. Sterling pulled a silver whistle from his pocket and blew a sharp, piercing blast that cut through the jazz music. 3 marked municipal police cruisers instantly turned the corner, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the darkening sky, pulling directly up to the wrought iron gates. "This premises must be completely vacated immediately," Mr. Sterling announced loudly to the stunned crowd. "Everyone must proceed to their vehicles and exit the grounds. Anyone remaining on the property in 10 minutes will be subject to immediate arrest for criminal trespassing on a condemned municipal hazard site." The reaction was instantaneous and utterly chaotic. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. The catering staff immediately dropped their silver trays and sprinted for the service exit. Our aunts and uncles shrieked in panic, hiking up their expensive dresses and practically trampling each other in their desperate rush to reach the valet stand before the police officers approached the lawn. But the most beautiful reaction came from Harrison's investors. The men he owed millions of dollars completely surrounded him. Their faces were carved from stone, their eyes burning with lethal intent. They realized simultaneously that Harrison had lied to them about his liquidity, lied to them about his real estate portfolio, and lied to them about his ability to repay their stolen funds. He had invited them here to show off a mansion that was literally sinking into the ground and actively being seized by the bank. Harrison was hyperventilating, foaming at the mouth, his arms flailing wildly as he tried to push past the angry investors. "Lydia, you did this!" he shrieked, his voice hitting a hysterical, panicked pitch. "You ruined everything. I am going to make you pay for this." 2 municipal police officers marched across the lawn, grabbing Harrison by the shoulders and physically hauling him away from the furious investors. He thrashed and kicked, screaming my name into the night sky as they dragged him unceremoniously toward the exit, completely humiliating him in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. I stood on the paved walkway, completely untouched by the surrounding chaos. I watched the flashing blue lights illuminate the absolute panic on my brother's face. The massive mansion loomed behind him, a dark, condemned monument to his catastrophic greed and endless hubris. He had tried to lock me out of my legacy, assuming I would quietly fade into the background. Instead, I had systematically dismantled his entire fraudulent life, exposing his lies, destroying his credibility, and legally evicting him from the very ground he stood on. And the truly magnificent part was that I had not even utilized my most devastating weapon yet. Tomorrow morning, at the official will reading, he would discover that the entire manufacturing empire he thought he still possessed was just an empty hollow shell. The real power, the intellectual property, and the land belonged solely to me. I turned my back on his screaming, thrashing form, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement, feeling nothing but cold, absolute victory. Morning sun glared off the glass and steel exterior of the downtown high-rise housing the law firm of Caldwell and Associates. I stepped out of the elevator on the 40th floor, my posture rigid and expression unreadable. The heavy mahogany doors of the primary conference room stood open, revealing a space designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, casting sharp shadows across the marble table. I crossed the threshold and the chaotic noise of my extended family hit me. They were already gathered, buzzing like anxious bees, entirely focused on the man of the hour. Harrison stood near the head of the table, adjusting his custom silk tie. Despite being physically thrown off his own condemned property by municipal police less than 12 hours ago, he had somehow managed to reconstruct his facade of absolute arrogance. He was not alone. Hovering just over his shoulder were 3 of the same aggressive, shady investors from the disastrous party last night. Their faces were tense, their eyes scanning the luxurious room with predatory calculation. Harrison had actually brought his furious creditors to a private family will reading, using the promise of this impending inheritance as a desperate shield to keep them from breaking his legs. He was cornered, and this was his final play. He was treating a solemn legal proceeding like a victory lap, desperate to prove to these dangerous men that he was seconds away from possessing unlimited generational wealth. I walked quietly into the room holding my leather briefcase. When my aunts and uncles spotted me, the nervous chatter instantly evaporated into suffocating silence. Aunt Beatrice turned her back, pulling her designer shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if my presence might contaminate her. Uncle Arthur cleared his throat and stepped closer to Harrison, signaling unwavering loyalty to the heir. They had watched Harrison get dragged away by police last night, but willingly swallowed whatever lie he spun to explain it. He was the golden boy, and they were deeply invested in his success. I scanned the massive marble table. Every plush leather executive chair was occupied. Felicity sat to Harrison's right, wearing a black morning dress more suited for a red carpet event than a legal reading. She caught my eye and offered a thin, razor-sharp smile, patting the empty space on the table in front of her where she expected the massive estate checks to be placed. There were no remaining seats at the table. A junior legal assistant, looking incredibly uncomfortable, gestured awkwardly toward a flimsy metal folding chair pushed against the far back wall next to a potted ficus. The physical exclusion was deliberate and incredibly childish. It was a calculated visual demonstration of the family hierarchy. Harrison and Felicity reigned supreme at the head of the table, while the disgraced dropout sister was literally relegated to the shadows. I did not argue or demand a better seat. I calmly walked to the back of the room and sat down on the cold metal chair, resting my briefcase securely on my lap. Their pathetic echo chamber of validation meant absolutely nothing to me today. The side door opened and Mr. Caldwell entered. He was a severe, sharply dressed man with a reputation for absolute ruthless efficiency. He carried a leather-bound portfolio and did not offer a single word of comfort to the room. He took his seat at the head of the table, arranging his gold reading glasses, and unclasped the portfolio. Before he could read the opening legal preamble, Harrison slammed his palm flat against the marble table. "Let us skip the drawn-out legal formalities," Caldwell Harrison barked, his voice loud and impatient. "My investors are busy men, and we have a massive manufacturing empire to transition today. Just hand over the primary deeds and the master account routing numbers so we can conclude this circus." Mr. Caldwell froze, his hands resting lightly on the stacked documents. He peered over the rim of his glasses, fixing Harrison with a look of glacial disapproval. "This is a formal legal proceeding, Mr. Vance. I will read the document precisely as it was written and legally filed." Harrison scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair and gesturing dismissively toward the back of the room where I sat. "There is nothing to read. My father made his intentions completely clear while he was alive. I am the sole executor. I am the only one who actually contributed to the family business. She is just here to waste our time and beg for a handout. You can officially state for the record that Lydia is completely disinherited, so she can take her little folding chair and leave my building." The sheer entitlement radiating from his pores was staggering. He was putting on a show for the three investors standing behind him, practically begging them to believe he was in absolute control of the room. I maintained my silence, letting his arrogant words hang in the heavy air. I knew exactly what was inside that briefcase. Mr. Caldwell ignored the outburst. He cleared his throat and began reading the primary will in a steady drone. The early sections covered minor bequests, leaving small cash sums to various charities, causing a ripple of excited murmurs among the aunts and uncles. Then he reached the core of the document. "Regarding the primary corporate entity known as Vance Manufacturing, I leave the entirety of the corporate structure to my son, Harrison. Vance." Mr. Caldwell read, his voice echoing against the glass walls. "Harrison is hereby granted the permanent title of Chief Executive Officer. He inherits the physical manufacturing warehouses, the heavy production machinery, the raw inventory, and the active corporate bank accounts associated with daily operations." I watched Harrison visibly inflate. He puffed out his chest, a massive grin splitting his face. The investors behind him noticeably relaxed their tense postures as they heard the confirmation of physical assets and corporate accounts. Mr. Caldwell continued reading, detailing how Harrison was tasked with maintaining the production lines and managing hundreds of factory employees. The primary will was what Harrison had anticipated. It was the document our father had drafted years ago when he still blindly believed Harrison was a financial genius capable of running a massive industrial operation. Our father had handed him the keys to the physical kingdom, unaware that Harrison was completely incapable of actually leading it. The will explicitly transferred the burden of the massive corporate overhead, the crumbling union contracts, and the aging supply chains directly onto his shoulders. It was a monumental responsibility disguised as a golden ticket, and Harrison was far too greedy and short-sighted to understand the difference. When Mr. Caldwell finished the final sentence regarding the corporate transfer, Harrison leapt out of his leather chair. He let out a loud, booming cheer, clapping his hands. He turned immediately to his investors, grabbing the hand of the most aggressive man. "Gentlemen, the empire is secured," Harrison gloated, making sure his voice carried to every corner of the room. "The liquidity issues are entirely resolved. We are moving forward with the massive expansion phase." Felicity clapped delicately from her seat, already calculating how to spend the imaginary millions. Harrison turned his victorious sneer toward the back of the room, pointing a finger at me. "Did you hear that, Lydia? It is all mine. The warehouses, the corporate accounts, the title. You get absolutely nothing. You are a penniless dropout, and you are officially trespassing on my corporate time. Now get out of here before I have security throw you onto the pavement again." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my hands folded neatly on top of my briefcase, maintaining unblinking eye contact with my brother. The room erupted into a chaotic chorus of congratulations, with aunts and uncles standing up to pat Harrison on the back and praise his brilliant new status as CEO. The celebration was loud, obnoxious, and entirely premature. At the head of the marble table, Mr. Caldwell did not close his leather portfolio. He did not smile or join in the chaotic applause. He simply reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, and methodically cleaned the lenses of his gold reading glasses. He placed them back on his nose, picking up a sealed envelope from his stack. He tapped the heavy envelope sharply against the marble table, a sharp cracking sound that instantly sliced through the celebratory noise. The room fell into a sudden, confused silence. Harrison stopped shaking hands, turning back toward the head of the table with a deep scowl. "What is the holdup?" Caldwell Harrison demanded. "We are done now. Pass over the paperwork." Mr. Caldwell calmly adjusted his glasses, looking directly into Harrison's flushed, arrogant face. "Please sit down, Mr. Vance." Mr. Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "I have not read the codicil." Harrison froze with his hand suspended midway through a victorious backslap with the tallest of his shady investors. The arrogant grin physically slid off his face and was instantly replaced by a deep, ugly scowl that hardened his features into something frantic and brittle. The surrounding chorus of sycophantic applause from our aunts and uncles died a sudden, agonizing death. The heavy mahogany boardroom plunged back into a suffocating, absolute silence. The only sound remaining in the entire space was the soft, steady ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner. Harrison slowly lowered his hand, his eyes darting between the thick, sealed envelope resting on the marble table and Mr. Caldwell's completely impassive face. "What do you mean you have not read the codicil?" Harrison demanded. His voice had lost its booming, triumphant resonance and now carried a sharp, desperate edge. "There is no codicil. My father and I discussed the estate plan extensively before he passed. He wanted me to have the company. The manufacturing empire is mine. He made me the sole executor, and I am claiming my rightful property right now. Stop playing these pathetic legal games and hand over the formal transfer documents." Mr. Caldwell did not flinch. He simply picked up a silver letter opener and slid it neatly under the flap of the heavy envelope, breaking the wax seal with a crisp, tearing sound that echoed like a gunshot. A codicil, by its very legal definition, supersedes the original drafting of the primary will. Mr. Caldwell explained, his tone completely devoid of emotion. It represents the final verified wishes of the deceased. Your mother, as the primary beneficiary and joint owner of the estate, legally executed this document precisely 3 months prior to the fatal accident. Your verbal discussions with your father are entirely irrelevant in the face of this binding physical contract. Harrison gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "What does it change?" he hissed. "Tell me exactly what it changes right now." I remained in my folding chair at the back of the room, watching the spectacular implosion begin. Felicity was sitting rigidly next to Harrison, her manicured fingers twisting the fabric of her expensive black mourning dress. She looked frantically around the room, sensing the impending disaster, before her husband even grasped the reality of the situation. The investors standing directly behind Harrison exchanged dark, highly calculating glances. They were dangerous men who dealt strictly in cash and collateral, and they smelled blood in the water. Mr. Caldwell deliberately unfolded the thick, crisp pages of the newly minted codicil and smoothed them flat against the marble. "The codicil does not revoke your title as Chief Executive Officer of Vance Manufacturing," Mr. Caldwell stated, reading the introductory clause. "You are still the legal owner of the operating corporate entity. You still control the employee payroll, the active supply chain logistics, and the overarching corporate brand." Harrison let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, blowing a puff of air through his teeth. He turned back to his investors, offering them a strained, tight smile. "You see, gentlemen," he said, his voice pitching upward with forced bravado, "it is just legal red tape. The operating entity is fully secured. The factories are mine. I told you there was absolutely nothing to worry about. We control the entire board." "Please do not interrupt me, Mr. Vance," Mr. Caldwell warned, his voice dropping another chilling octave. "Because while you inherit the corporate operating entity, you also inherit its comprehensive legal liabilities. The codicil explicitly unseals the private forensic audit your mother commissioned shortly before her passing. The results of that deep financial investigation are now a permanent matter of public probate record." The air in the room grew instantly thick and heavy. Harrison swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat rolling down the side of his neck and soaking into his custom silk collar. Mr. Caldwell flipped to the second page of the document, his eyes scanning the dense columns of forensic accounting data. "According to the independent financial audit, Vance Manufacturing is not a thriving corporate empire." Mr. Caldwell read, his voice mercilessly clear and steady. "The company has been systemically drained of all liquid operating capital over the past 36 months. The funds were unlawfully redirected to cover the catastrophic failures of a secondary investment firm wholly owned by Harrison Vance. Because of the massive secret debts you personally incurred and the fraudulent leveraging of corporate assets, the current valuation of Vance Manufacturing is deeply, deeply in the red." Aunt Beatrice dropped her expensive designer purse onto the floor, the heavy clasp clattering against the hardwood. The aunts and uncles who had been eagerly cheering for Harrison just 3 minutes ago were now staring at him with wide, horrified eyes. He had lost millions. He had bankrupted the very foundation of their generational wealth. "That is a complete lie," Harrison shouted, slamming both of his fists onto the table so hard the water glasses rattled. "It is a temporary cash flow issue. The market took a bad turn and I simply borrowed against our own internal equity to cover the margins. It is standard corporate restructuring. You are twisting the numbers to make me look bad. I am the CEO, and I know exactly what this company is truly worth." The tallest investor, a man with cold, dead eyes, grabbed Harrison roughly by the shoulder and forcibly spun him around. "You told us this company was generating pure liquid profit." The investor growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that completely silenced the panicked murmurs of the extended family. "You told us you were inheriting a gold mine. You owe us a staggering amount of money, Harrison. If this company is buried in red ink, how exactly do you plan to repay us?" Harrison was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and frantic as he looked at the 3 furious men surrounding him. He threw up his hands in a desperate, placating gesture, stepping backward until his hip hit the edge of the marble table. He decided to throw our parents' entire legacy directly into the roaring fire, just to save his own pathetic skin. "Listen to me," Harrison pleaded, his voice cracking as he looked desperately at the investors. "You do not understand the scale of what we actually own. The operating debts are completely meaningless. Do you know how much prime commercial real estate this company sits on? We own 4 massive industrial warehouses directly in the middle of the most highly sought-after zoning district in the city. The actual land value alone is astronomical." He turned back around, gesturing wildly toward Mr. Caldwell. "I do not care if the factory accounts are drained. I do not care about the machinery or the payroll or the patents. The second this meeting is over, I am bringing in the bulldozers. I am going to completely level every single manufacturing plant we own. I will fire every single worker, terminate the union contracts, and sell the empty commercial lots to the highest bidding luxury developer. We will liquidate the physical ground it sits on," he proudly boasted, his voice echoing in the shocked room. "We will sell the land to cover the margins and walk away with tens of millions in pure, untraceable profit. The family legacy is nothing but a massive piggy bank, and I am smashing it wide open today. You will all get your money back with interest by Friday afternoon, I promise you." He did not care about the employees who had faithfully worked for our family for 3 generations. He did not care about the business our grandfather had built from scratch. He only saw the destruction of our heritage as a convenient escape hatch for his own criminal incompetence. The investors slowly relaxed their aggressive postures, exchanging calculating glances. The prospect of liquidating prime downtown real estate was highly appealing to them. Harrison breathed a heavy sigh of relief, believing he had successfully talked his way out of a brutal reckoning. Mr. Caldwell watched the entire desperate performance with a completely blank expression. He reached down into his thick leather portfolio and pulled out a massive, heavy stack of bound financial ledgers. The sheer weight of the documents made a loud, heavy thud as he dropped them directly onto the center of the marble table right in front of Harrison. "You inherit the company, Harrison," Mr. Caldwell stated, his voice sharp and utterly merciless. "And you inherit its $15 million in hidden debt. The active payroll, the defaulted corporate loans, and the impending bankruptcy proceedings are now your sole exclusive legal responsibility." Harrison stared at the towering stack of debt, his arrogant smile returning as he puffed out his chest. "I just told you, Caldwell, I am liquidating the real estate. The land sale will cover the $15 million and leave me with a massive surplus. Hand me the property deeds right now." Mr. Caldwell placed his hands flat on top of the heavy ledgers. He looked directly into Harrison's greedy, expectant eyes. "However, you cannot liquidate the land." Harrison froze. The triumphant smirk vanished. He gripped the edge of the table, leaning forward until he was inches from the lawyer's face. "What did you just say? Why the hell can I not sell my own land? I am the CEO. I control the assets. Hand me the deeds right now." Mr. Caldwell did not blink. He sat perfectly still, delivering the final devastating blow with absolute surgical precision. Because the land, the proprietary manufacturing patents, and the deed to the family home were legally transferred entirely out of the company exactly a year ago. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Harrison stopped breathing. The investors stepped forward, their eyes burning with fresh, lethal rage. Harrison slowly turned his head, looking past the investors, past the horrified aunts and uncles, and locked his wide, terrified eyes directly onto me, sitting quietly in my folding chair at the back of the room. I offered him a slow, cold smile. The trap had officially snapped shut. He was ruined. The absolute silence inside the mahogany boardroom lasted for perhaps 3 agonizing seconds, before the entire room fractured into total bedlam. The illusion of wealth had been shattered, and the resulting shockwave was instantaneous. The 3 dangerous investors standing directly behind Harrison did not shout or join the chaotic chorus of the extended family. They simply moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, stepping forward to completely box Harrison against the edge of the polished marble table. Their physical proximity was a silent, lethal threat. Harrison violently shoved his leather executive chair backward, the heavy wood crashing loudly against the floorboards as he lunged toward the head of the table. He slammed both of his sweating hands down onto the thick stacks of legal documents, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple. "That is completely illegal!" Harrison screamed, spraying saliva across the marble surface. "You cannot secretly carve up a corporate entity and hide the prime assets in a shadow trust without the direct consent of the chief executive officer. My father gave me this company. He promised me the land and the estate. You forged this entire ridiculous document, Caldwell. You and my pathetic sister cooked up this fraudulent scheme to steal my rightful inheritance. I will have you disbarred and thrown in prison for this stunt." Mr. Caldwell did not flinch. He did not raise his hands to defend himself against Harrison's aggressive physical posture. He simply reached out and firmly removed his legal documents from beneath Harrison's trembling palms, smoothing the creased paper with methodical care. This document was executed in the presence of 3 independent witnesses and a senior superior court judge. Mr. Caldwell stated, his voice cutting through the shouting like a sharpened blade. "Your mother possessed full legal authority over the shared marital assets. She was entirely within her rights to protect the physical property from your catastrophic financial mismanagement. This codicil is ironclad, Mr. Vance. You own a bankrupt shell." Aunt Beatrice gasped loudly, pressing a manicured hand to her chest as she collapsed back into her chair. Uncle Arthur, who had spent the entire morning patting Harrison on the back and praising his business acumen, suddenly took a very large, deliberate step away from the golden boy. Felicity remained frozen in her seat. Her perfectly glossed lips parted in sheer horror as she mentally calculated the rapid evaporation of her lavish lifestyle. Her eyes darted toward the heavy oak doors, already searching for an escape route. Mr. Caldwell reached deeply into his leather portfolio and withdrew a secondary envelope. This one was crafted from heavy cream stationery, bearing the distinct embossed monogram of our mother. The room immediately recognized the familiar crest. The frantic shouting and panicked murmuring instantly died down, replaced by a tense, suffocating anticipation. "This is a personal letter, dictated and signed by your mother, to be read aloud, in the presence of the entire family, directly following the revelation of the codicil," Mr. Caldwell announced. He sliced the heavy envelope open with his silver letter opener and carefully unfolded the crisp pages. Harrison stood trembling violently, his chest heaving as Mr. Caldwell began to read. "To my family," the letter began in Mr. Caldwell's steady, unyielding cadence. "If you are hearing these specific words, it means I am gone, and the ugly truth can no longer be hidden behind closed doors and polite society smiles. For years, your father and I lived in a state of willful, deliberate blindness. We placed our only son on an impossible pedestal, showering him with absolute praise and unlimited financial resources. We convinced ourselves and everyone in this room that his endless mistakes were simply growing pains. We enabled a monster, and we were spectacularly, tragically wrong." Mr. Caldwell turned the page, his eyes scanning the text without a single shred of sympathy. "I spent the last year of my life uncovering the absolute depths of Harrison's deception." The letter continued, the words striking the room like physical blows. "I hired independent forensic accountants to track the missing corporate funds. I saw the horrifying bank statements and the falsified ledgers. Harrison did not just mismanage the family business. He systematically pillaged it. He embezzled over $15 million through entirely fabricated vendor invoices and ghost employee payrolls." The investors behind Harrison leaned in closer, their broad shoulders literally swallowing him in shadow. "He funneled our generational wealth into secret offshore accounts to feed a catastrophic illegal gambling addiction," the letter relentlessly continued. "I tracked his massive losses across high-stakes tables in Macau and illegal underground syndicates right here in our own city. He took out fraudulent loans using our home as collateral to cover his massive margin calls. He treated the livelihoods of our loyal factory workers as his own personal casino chips. He is a parasite who fed on our blind love, and he would have left this entire family completely destitute if I had not intervened." The extended family let out a collective synchronized gasp. The facade was completely obliterated. The aunts and uncles who had eagerly enabled his arrogant behavior for decades, who had shunned me to favor him, were finally forced to look at the wretched reality of the man they had backed. They stared at Harrison with undisguised revulsion, realizing he had viewed them all as nothing more than an audience for his pathetic theatrical lies. Mr. Caldwell continued reading, his voice carrying the heavy, profound weight of a mother's dying regret. To my daughter Lydia, the letter stated, causing every single head in the room to snap toward the back wall where I was seated. We failed you completely. We constantly criticized your fierce independence, your choice to build your own architectural firm, your flat refusal to bow to our rigid, toxic expectations. We called you rebellious and difficult when you were simply demonstrating the exact strength and moral integrity that your brother completely lacked. I remained seated on the flimsy metal folding chair, completely motionless. You walked away from our toxic wealth and built a brilliant, sustainable life entirely on your own terms. The letter praised. You possess the brilliant mind and the unbreakable ethical spine that this family desperately needs. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry that it took my impending death to finally see you clearly. I spent my final months securing the actual assets of this family away from Harrison's greedy hands so that you could protect our true legacy. My posture remained absolutely perfectly straight. I did not offer a smug smile. I did not cross my arms or display any outward sign of triumph. I did not shed a single tear of validation. I simply sat in the shadows, keeping my hands neatly folded over my leather briefcase, observing the room with cool, calculating detachment. I watched the profound realization wash over the faces of the people who had abused and marginalized me for my entire existence. I watched my mother's final words strike them from the grave, shattering their comfortable delusions and exposing their eager complicity in Harrison's crimes. Harrison was visibly shaking now. The nervous sweat poured freely down his face, ruining his custom silk collar and soaking into his expensive suit jacket. He looked frantically at the angry investors closing in tightly around him, then looked back at the lawyer, his eyes wide with sheer animal panic. He realized his physical safety was in immediate, absolute jeopardy. Fine. Harrison choked out his voice, reduced to a desperate, frantic whisper. Fine. The manufacturing company is bankrupt. I accept the operating debt. But the land is still out there. The proprietary patents are still active. The physical estate is still standing. If the prime assets were transferred into a blind holding trust, then someone has to actively manage it. Someone has the supreme legal authority to liquidate those properties and pay off these violent men standing behind me. Tell me who controls the holding trust, Caldwell. Tell me who I need to speak to right now to negotiate an immediate buyout. Mr. Caldwell neatly folded the cream-colored letter and slid it securely back into the envelope. He placed his hands flat on the polished marble table. Slowly, deliberately, the strict family lawyer lifted his gaze, looking past the sweating, ruined figure of Harrison Vance. He looked past the horrified aunts and uncles, past the furious, dangerous investors, and looked directly at the back of the room. The sole owner and executor of the blind trust is Lydia. The words hung heavy and absolute. The tallest investor, the man who had just been celebrating a massive real estate liquidation, abruptly released Harrison's shoulder. He took a slow, menacing step backward, his cold eyes sweeping over the sweating, terrified man trapped against the marble table. The other two investors flanked him, creating an impenetrable wall of custom-tailored suits and barely contained violence. They did not need a law degree to understand the devastating implications of Mr. Caldwell's statement. Without the land to sell and the patents that allowed the factories to produce their goods, Vance Manufacturing was nothing more than a hollow, bleeding carcass of a company. It was $15 million of pure, unadulterated debt tethered entirely to a catastrophic liar. "You set us up," the tallest investor snarled, his voice dropping to a terrifying, gravelly pitch. He slammed his heavy palms onto the table, trapping Harrison between his thick arms. "You brought us into this room promising a gold mine. You told us you had guaranteed collateral. You swore on your miserable life that the real estate alone would cover the margins. But you own absolutely nothing. You are a bankrupt fraud. Harrison pressed his spine hard against the edge of the table, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors, calculating his escape route. There was none. The three men leaned in closer, invading his personal space, their sheer physical presence suffocating him. "I want my money back," the second investor demanded, jabbing a thick, calloused finger directly into Harrison's sternum. "I want every single cent you bled out of my syndicate. I want the principal, I want the interest, and I want it right now. If you do not wire those funds into my offshore account by the time I walk out of this building, the police taking you away from that party last night will look like a gentle embrace." Harrison was visibly trembling, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked at his wife Felicity, who had completely pressed herself against the far wall, her face pale, actively pretending she did not know him. He looked at Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Arthur, the relatives who had championed him for decades. They refused to meet his gaze, suddenly fascinated by the intricate patterns woven into the Persian rug. He was entirely, brutally alone. The sheer animal panic in Harrison's eyes suddenly fractured, shifting into something even more pathetic. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy completely disintegrated. He shoved his way past the investors, ignoring their furious shouts, and stumbled clumsily toward the back of the room. He stopped 3 feet away from my folding chair, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing against the polished floor. He dropped to his knees. The sound of his knees hitting the hardwood echoed sharply in the silent room. Harrison Vance, the man who had spent his entire life looking down on me, was kneeling on the floor, looking up at me with wide, begging, bloodshot eyes. He clasped his trembling hands together, completely dropping his arrogant facade. "Lydia, please." He choked out, a thin line of sweat dripping down his forehead. "You have to fix this. You have to sign the patents back over to the operating company. You have to transfer the land deed back into my name." I remained perfectly still, my hands resting gracefully on my leather briefcase. I did not blink. I simply watched him unravel. "We are family," Harrison pleaded, weaponizing the very concept he had spent his life destroying. He crawled forward, reaching out as if to grab the hem of my skirt, though he dared not actually touch me. "We share the same blood. You cannot just sit there and watch these men ruin my life. Our parents would be absolutely horrified. Mom and Dad built this company for us. They wanted us to protect the Vance legacy. You owe it to their memory to keep this company intact. You owe it to me, Lydia. You are my sister. You have to save your brother." He was crying now, actual, genuine tears of terror streaming down his flushed face, soaking his expensive silk collar. He was weaponizing family loyalty, desperately trying to invoke the ghosts of our parents to force me back into my designated role as the compliant sacrificial scapegoat. He expected me to fold. He expected my inherent decency to override my sense of self-preservation. He fundamentally believed that a few desperate tears and a manipulative appeal to our shared DNA would instantly erase decades of systematic abuse. I looked down at the weeping, trembling man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sympathy, no residual sisterly affection. The well of my compassion had run completely, permanently dry. Family loyalty. I repeated, my voice calm, smooth, and echoing with devastating precision through the quiet boardroom. "That is a fascinating concept, Harrison. Let us examine your definition of family loyalty." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on my briefcase, locking my eyes directly onto his terrified face. "Do you remember the winter 3 years ago? My architectural firm had just lost its primary venture capital funding. My husband had walked out, emptying our joint checking accounts and leaving me with a mountain of his hidden debt. I had a 3-year-old son, an eviction notice on my apartment door, and absolutely nowhere else to go. I came to the family estate. I came to the house our parents built, the house with 8 empty guest bedrooms, and I knocked on the front door." Harrison swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously away from my steady gaze. "It was pouring freezing rain that night." I continued, painting the picture with cold, relentless clarity. Every aunt, uncle, and investor in the room hung on to my every word. I stood on the porch shivering, holding my little boy wrapped in a thin blanket. "You answered the door holding a glass of scotch. You did not invite us inside out of the storm. You stepped out onto the porch, looked at my crying child, and told me that I was nothing but a tenant who had overstayed her welcome in this family." Harrison opened his mouth to speak to offer some pathetic, fabricated excuse, but my voice cut through his words like a whip. You told me failure was a contagious disease and refused to let it infect your perfect home. You grabbed the duffel bag of my son's toys, the only possessions we carried onto the bus, and threw it directly off the porch into the freezing mud. You told me to find a homeless shelter, turned around, and locked the heavy door in my face. I sat back in my folding chair, my posture immaculate. I spent that night sleeping in a fluorescent downtown emergency clinic, holding my toddler, praying he would not catch pneumonia. I built my life back from rock bottom, while you sat in our parents' mansion drinking imported scotch. Do not dare kneel on this floor and invoke the word family to me. You severed that tie in the freezing rain. Harrison's tears vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, cornered rage. The pathetic, weeping brother evaporated, revealing the ruthless, entitled parasite beneath. He scrambled up from the floor, his face twisting into a mask of pure malice. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face, stepping dangerously close to my chair. You vindictive, spiteful witch, Harrison spat. You think you have outsmarted me. You think you can swoop in and steal my company. Those manufacturing patents are absolutely essential to Vance Manufacturing. Without them, the assembly lines cannot function. I am still the chief executive officer. I will hire the most aggressive litigators in Illinois. I will drag you into court and sue you. I will bury you in endless legal injunctions until you are completely bankrupt. Those patents belong to me. He was panting heavily, convinced his frantic legal threats would finally break my unyielding composure. The aggressive investors watched closely, a faint glimmer of hope returning to their predatory eyes. If Harrison successfully sued for the patents, the company might retain some salvageable value. They waited eagerly, expecting me to cower under the threat. I did not cower. I did not raise my voice. I simply lifted my left wrist, letting the sleeve of my blazer fall back to reveal a diamond-encrusted watch. I checked the time with slow, deliberate elegance, observing the delicate sweep of the second hand. You cannot sue me for the proprietary manufacturing patents, Harrison, I replied smoothly, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. Because I no longer own them. Harrison froze, his aggressive finger still suspended in the air. What are you talking about? I sold the exclusive irrevocable rights to every single patent to your biggest international competitor at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, I stated, offering him a slow, chilling smile. The wire transfer just cleared. The finality of my statement hung in the air, a brutal, absolute truth, severing Harrison's last remaining lifeline. The towering investors who had been breathing down his neck instantly understood the devastating trap. The manufacturing patents were the beating heart of Vance Manufacturing, the legally protected blueprints and exclusive rights that allowed the factories to produce their specialized components. Without those specific patents, the massive physical warehouses Harrison inherited were absolutely useless, empty brick shells filled with obsolete machinery, completely incapable of legally producing a single profitable item. The investors did not yell or threaten him any further. Their silence was infinitely more terrifying. The tallest investor reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a sleek smartphone, and began typing a rapid message. He looked at Harrison with eyes devoid of any empathy. You are a dead man walking, he stated, his voice a low, lethal promise that guaranteed absolute ruin. The three men turned in perfect unison and walked out of the mahogany boardroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind them with a definitive thud. Harrison remained frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a sickening, pale pallor. He slowly turned his head toward the marble table, desperately seeking some miraculous legal loophole from Mr. Caldwell. The strict estate lawyer simply closed his thick leather portfolio, signaling the absolute conclusion of the official probate reading. The transaction is fully documented and legally binding, Mr. Caldwell confirmed, adjusting his gold reading glasses. Your sister operated with absolute legal authority. It was at this precise moment that Felicity finally shattered. She had remained pressed against the far wall throughout the entire brutal confrontation. Her perfectly glossed lips parted in unadulterated horror as she mentally tabulated the evaporating millions. The designer morning dress she wore suddenly looked less like a red carpet statement and more like a highly appropriate funeral shroud for her lavish lifestyle. Her eyes darted frantically, taking in the horrified expressions of the extended family, the unyielding stoicism of the estate lawyer, and the sweating, pathetic ruin of her husband. The realization crashed over her with the force of a speeding freight train. Her husband was not a wealthy industrial tycoon inheriting a generational empire. He was a catastrophic failure carrying $15 million in hidden corporate debt. The sprawling estate she had spent months redesigning now legally belonged entirely to me. The manufacturing company was a hollow, bankrupt shell. The bank accounts were empty. The luxury cars parked in their driveway were leased and days away from repossession. Felicity pushed herself away from the wall, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The elegant socialite evaporated, revealing the vicious, calculating opportunist beneath the expensive cosmetics. She marched directly toward Harrison, her hands balled into tight, trembling fists at her sides. "You absolute pathetic fraud!" Felicity screamed, her voice shattering the remaining tension in the room. The sound was shrill and desperate, echoing violently off the glass walls. "You stood in our kitchen yesterday and swore to me that the liquidity crisis was entirely resolved. You looked me right in the eye and promised that this miserable company was worth $50 million. You promised me the estate, the renovations, the winter house in Aspen." Harrison flinched, recoiling from her verbal assault as if she struck him. "Felicity, please," he begged, his voice cracking under the weight of absolute humiliation. "Keep your voice down. We are in front of the family. We can figure this out. I can leverage the factory equipment. I can secure a bridge loan. I just need time to restructure the remaining assets." "Restructure what assets, Harrison?" She shrieked, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing wildly toward the empty marble table. "There is nothing left to restructure. You owe $15 million to men who look like they solve their financial disputes with cement shoes. You do not even own the ground you are standing on. You are completely bankrupt." The aunts and uncles watched the spectacular implosion in stunned, horrified silence. Aunt Beatrice covered her mouth with a trembling hand, incapable of processing the vicious reality of the Golden Boy's marriage. They spent years praising Felicity's refined taste, ignoring that her affection was conditional upon Harrison's bank balance. Now they were witnessing a marriage built purely on financial convenience collapsing in real time. "You ruined my life, Harrison," Felicity continued, her voice dripping with pure venom. "I spent 5 years smiling at your obnoxious relatives, sitting through these tedious family dinners, pretending to care about your pathetic golf handicap because you promised me an empire. You told me you were the sole heir. You told me your father practically worshipped the ground you walked on. You are nothing but a degenerate gambler and a pathetic liar." She stepped closer, jabbing her finger into his chest, forcing him to stumble backward against the heavy leather chair. "I am not going down with your sinking ship," she snarled. "I am not moving into some tiny rented apartment while you dodge creditors and process your bankruptcy filings. I absolutely refuse to live like a peasant just because my husband is an incompetent idiot." Harrison looked completely destroyed. The man who spent his life bullying everyone around him was defenseless against the singular person he chose as his partner. He opened his mouth to beg her to stay, but the words died in his throat. Felicity did not wait for his pathetic response. She spun around on her designer heels, her calculating eyes scanning the room until they locked directly onto me. The vicious rage in her expression instantly morphed into a desperate, greedy calculation. She marched down the length of the marble table, ignoring the horrified stares of the extended family, and stopped directly in front of my folding chair. "Lydia." She began, her voice suddenly adopting a sickly sweet pleading tone that made my stomach churn. "Lydia, you have to understand my position. I had absolutely no idea he was stealing from your mother. I had no idea about the secret offshore accounts or the gambling debts. He lied to me just like he lied to everyone else in this room. I am a victim in this situation too." I remained perfectly still, my hands folded neatly over my leather briefcase, refusing to offer her a single ounce of encouragement. "You just sold those proprietary patents for tens of millions of dollars. Felicity continued, her eyes gleaming with undisguised monetary desperation. You own the family estate. You control the holding trust. You have more liquid cash right now than this entire family combined. I should not suffer and lose everything just because my husband is a complete financial disaster. I invested 5 years of my life into this family. I deserve compensation for my time. She leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the edge of the table, her voice dropping to a frantic, demanding whisper. Give me my share, Lydia. Cut me a check from the patent sale. I only need a few million to maintain my lifestyle and secure a new property. You owe it to me for putting up with his abuse for all these years. Give me my cut and I will walk away from him forever. The unapologetic materialism radiating from her pores was staggering. She was standing in a legal boardroom, openly demanding a multi-million-dollar payout from the sister-in-law she relentlessly mocked and excluded for years, simply to abandon her ruined husband. She viewed human relationships purely as transactional contracts, and she was demanding her severance pay. I looked at her desperate, flushed face, taking in the smeared, expensive mascara, and the frantic, greedy light in her eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not express any anger or outrage at her ridiculous demand. I simply offered her the same slow, cold smile I had given my brother moments earlier. You married him, Felicity? I stated, my voice smooth and devoid of any human warmth. You signed the legal documents. You happily spent the stolen corporate funds on your designer wardrobe and your lavish vacations. You stood on the patio last night holding expensive champagne while he bragged about illegally demolishing my family home. You enjoyed the glorious spoils of his fraud. Therefore, you get to enjoy the catastrophic consequences. I leaned forward slightly, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute precision. You share his $15 million in hidden corporate debt, Felicity. You do not share a single cent of my secure assets. Now step away from my chair. Felicity stared at me, her jaw dropping as the absolute reality of her situation settled into her bones. She was trapped. She was legally tethered to a man drowning in millions of toxic debt and facing imminent ruin. There was no secret bailout. She faced absolute poverty. The pleading expression vanished instantly, replaced by cold finality. She stood straight, smoothing her mourning dress with trembling hands. Felicity reached down, grasping the custom diamond engagement ring Harrison bought using embezzled company funds. With a sharp, violent motion, she yanked the heavy diamond ring off her finger. She raised her hand high in the air and slammed the diamond down onto the polished marble table with brutal force. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the silent, horrified boardroom, perfectly punctuating the absolute end of their union. I am not paying a single dime of your pathetic debts, Harrison, she announced, her voice ringing with cold, clinical detachment. I have been secretly speaking to aggressive bankruptcy lawyers for the past 3 weeks, just in case your ridiculous real estate scheme imploded. They already drafted the formal separation papers to legally sever my personal accounts from your impending financial ruin. The divorce filings will be delivered to whatever cheap motel you end up sleeping in by the end of the week. Do not ever contact me again. She did not wait for his response. She did not look at the stunned extended family or offer a single parting word to the estate lawyer. She simply turned on her heel, her posture rigid and unyielding, and marched straight toward the heavy mahogany doors. She pushed them open, stepping out into the bright hallway, and walked away without looking back, completely abandoning the sinking ship of Harrison Vance. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind Felicity, leaving a ringing vacuum in her wake. Harrison stared blankly at the polished wood where his wife had just exited, his entire chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. The diamond ring sat abandoned on the marble table, capturing the overhead light and mocking him with its brilliant sparkle. But the suffocating silence did not last. The initial shockwave of Felicity's brutal departure rapidly receded, revealing a much darker, more immediate terror festering among the spectators. Aunt Beatrice, who had been clutching her chest, suddenly dropped her hand. Her pale eyes widened as a horrifying realization finally penetrated her manicured exterior. She looked across the table at Uncle Arthur, whose face had just drained of all remaining color. The independent financial audit Mr. Caldwell had read aloud specifically mentioned a secondary investment firm wholly owned by Harrison. It was the exact same exclusive high-yield tech portfolio Harrison had aggressively pitched to the entire extended family last Thanksgiving. He had stood in our parents' dining room, holding a glass of expensive wine, promising them a guaranteed 40% annual return. He had leveraged their unwavering blind trust to secure their absolute liquid capital and secretly drain their personal savings accounts. Harrison. Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden lethal edge. Harrison, look at me right now. He slowly turned his head, his eyes glazed and vacant, like a trapped animal realizing the steel cage was permanently sealed. The tech firm, Beatrice demanded, stepping out from behind her chair. Her designer heels clicked aggressively on the hardwood as she closed the distance. The secondary investment portfolio you convinced us to back. You told us it was generating unprecedented market returns. You told Arthur to cash out his entire pension and roll it into your private fund. You told me to liquidate my mutual funds. Where is our money? Harrison took a step backward, bumping hard into the edge of the table. Aunt Beatrice, I can explain, he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. His voice was weak and reedy, entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. It was a temporary market fluctuation. The capital is just tied up in standard restructuring protocols. The assets are completely safe. I just need a few weeks to unfreeze the primary accounts and shift the equity. Liar, Uncle Arthur roared, surging forward with unexpected violent speed. You heard Caldwell. The fund completely collapsed. You took our retirement accounts and you fed them to your illegal bookies. You stole from your own blood to cover your massive gambling debts. The room instantly transformed into a vicious feeding frenzy. The sycophantic echo chamber that had spent decades validating Harrison, praising his genius, and enabling his absolute arrogance violently and completely shattered. The aunts and uncles abandoned their polished country club manners and swarmed him. They surrounded Harrison, screaming, demanding immediate restitution, grabbing at his tailored suit jacket and pulling at his expensive silk tie. You promised me those specific dividends for my daughter's medical school tuition, Aunt Clara shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly into his face. I mortgaged my summer home for your venture fund. Uncle Arthur bellowed, his face inches from Harrison's sweating forehead. I want my money back today, Harrison. I will call the police right now and have you arrested for wire fraud. I will personally see you locked in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life. Harrison cowered against the table, completely suffocated by the very people who had worshipped him just an hour earlier. He was frantically babbling, offering impossible promises and desperate excuses, but his pathetic words were entirely drowned out by their furious, relentless demands. He was a dry well, and they finally recognized the devastating drought. Then, as quickly as the violent mob had descended upon him, a new chilling calculation swept through the desperate family. They realized simultaneously that screaming at a bankrupt fraud would not magically recover their lost millions. They needed a massive financial bailout. They needed actual liquid capital to save their comfortable lives, and there was only one person left in the room who possessed it. Like a flock of predatory birds changing direction mid-flight, the aunts and uncles completely abandoned Harrison. They turned their backs on his weeping, pathetic figure and synchronized their focus entirely onto me. The transition was nauseating to witness. The vicious rage contorting their faces melted away, instantly replaced by sickeningly sweet, forced smiles and wide, innocent eyes. Aunt Beatrice smoothed her pearl necklace and approached my folding chair with a cautious, gentle gait, as if approaching a skittish, wounded animal. Lydia, darling, she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. This is all just so terribly shocking. We are absolutely reeling from this horrible deception. We had no idea he was capable of such a monstrous betrayal. We are the true innocent victims here. He played us for absolute fools. Uncle Arthur stepped up beside her, nodding enthusiastically, his hands clasped together in a posture of desperate reverence. We always knew Harrison was trouble, Lydia. We really did. He was always so arrogant, so reckless with money. We tried to warn your parents over and over again, but they simply refused to listen to reason. They were blinded by him, but we saw the truth. We always secretly admired your independence. Beatrice reached out, attempting to place a comforting hand on my shoulder. I leaned back slightly, letting her hand drop into empty air. She did not miss a beat, simply clasping her hands together against her chest. "You have to know how incredibly proud we are of you, Lydia," she continued, completely ignoring my physical rejection. "You built your own incredible architectural firm. You secured the patents. You protected your mother's true legacy. You are the only responsible one in this entire family. You are the brilliant one." Arthur cleared his throat, offering a nervous, eager smile. "And because you are so responsible, Lydia, because you are the true head of the family, now we know you will do the right thing. Harrison stole our entire life savings. He ruined our retirements. But you have the patent money now. You have the millions from the corporate competitor. We just need a tiny fraction of that to make us whole again. You can bail us out, Lydia. It is what your parents would have wanted you to do. We are family, and family takes care of each other unconditionally." I looked at their expectant, greedy faces. These were the exact same people who had spent my entire life calling me a complete failure. They were the ones who told my parents to cut off my college tuition because my architectural degree was a ridiculous waste of money. They were the ones who laughed when Harrison locked me out in the freezing rain, claiming I was nothing but a dramatic burden seeking an unearned handout. Now they were standing before me openly begging for millions of dollars while pretending they had championed my independence all along. The absolute moral bankruptcy of my family was finally laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or demand dramatic apologies. I simply reached down and unlatched the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed loudly, slicing through their pathetic fawning. I opened the lid and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of crisp, white printer paper. I rested the stack on my lap, looking directly at Aunt Beatrice. "Do you remember calling my cell phone last Tuesday evening, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely hollow. "You left a highly detailed 3-minute voicemail." Beatrice blinked, her false smile faltering as she stared at the papers. "I am sure I was just stressed, darling. We were all so worried about the funeral arrangements and the estate logistics. I probably misspoke in the heat of the moment." I lifted the top sheet of paper from the stack. I had the audio file professionally transcribed. I stated smoothly, extending the paper toward her so she could read the bold text. "You told me that if I dared to show my face at the probate reading and challenge Harrison for a single dime of the estate, you would personally ensure I was permanently excommunicated from polite society. You explicitly called me a bitter, jealous spinster who was trying to leech off my brother's hard-earned success." Beatrice's mouth opened wide in sheer, silent horror. She suddenly stumbled backward, looking completely destroyed. I pulled the next sheet, showing Arthur his own vicious social media post. I stood up from my folding chair, holding the thick, heavy stack of remaining pages. I dropped the printouts onto the polished marble table. "I don't finance people who dare call me a parasite," I stated, effectively cutting off the entire toxic extended family in one single swift move. The completely horrified aunts and uncles stared down at the crisp white pages resting on the polished marble table. The vile words they had typed and spoken now sat under the harsh boardroom lighting, exposing their absolute hypocrisy. Aunt Beatrice let out a small gasp, taking a clumsy step backward. Uncle Arthur refused to look at the transcripts, turning his face away in humiliated silence. They had demanded a financial bailout built on the illusion of familial loyalty, and I had handed them their own toxic venom. They were completely paralyzed, stripped of their false moral high ground, and permanently severed from my wealth. The sudden, absolutely brutal departure of his sycophantic audience was the final devastating straw for Harrison. He had spent his entire existence propped up by the blind adoration of our parents and the greedy validation of our relatives. With Felicity gone, the investors demanding his head, and the family neutralized, Harrison finally recognized his absolute isolation. The realization erupted as pure, unrestrained physical violence. Harrison let out a loud, agonizing scream that violently tore from his throat, like a desperate cornered animal realizing the heavy trap was permanently locked. He lunged forward, gripping the edge of the marble table with both hands. He yanked himself toward the center, where a large silver coffee service tray rested. With a vicious sweep of his arm, he slammed into the heavy carafe and delicate porcelain cups. The tray launched into the air. The heavy carafe crashed against the hardwood floor, sending a wave of scalding black coffee splashing across the baseboards. The fine porcelain cups shattered into hundreds of jagged, razor-sharp fragments. Aunt Clara shrieked and shielded her face, backing into the far corner. Harrison did not stop. He was completely blinded by a primal destructive tantrum. He spun toward Mr. Caldwell, who was calmly gathering his legal documents. Harrison let out another feral shout and dove across the corner of the table, clawing frantically at the thick leather portfolio. He managed to grab a handful of the forensic audit pages detailing his catastrophic embezzlement. He ripped the crisp paper in half, his face twisted into sweating madness, foolishly believing that destroying the physical paper would magically erase his massive, insurmountable debts. Mr. Caldwell simply pressed a small, discreet button located under the lip of the boardroom table. The heavy double oak doors instantly burst open. Two massive, intimidating security guards dressed in immaculate dark suits rapidly charged into the boardroom. They moved with terrifying practiced efficiency, ignoring the shattered porcelain and spilled coffee. They reached Harrison just as he was tearing a second handful of the audit. The first guard grabbed Harrison by his ruined custom suit jacket, violently jerking him backward. The second guard seized his waist, turning his momentum against him. Harrison thrashed wildly, swinging his elbows and kicking his expensive shoes against the chairs. He screamed incoherent threats, demanding they unhand him. The guards were entirely unmoved, driving him backward with overwhelming physical force and slamming his spine hard against the oak-paneled wall. The brutal impact knocked the wind out of his lungs, resulting in a loud, agonizing wheeze. The guards pinned his arms securely against the wood, leaving him completely immobilized. Harrison was hyperventilating now. His chest heaved erratically, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting around the room in sheer panic. His expensive silk tie was torn, hanging loosely around his neck. The arrogant golden child was reduced to a sweating, pinned criminal throwing a physical tantrum because he could no longer manipulate reality. I stood up slowly from my folding chair at the back of the room. I smoothly straightened the front of my tailored blazer, quietly picked up my leather briefcase, and walked directly toward him. My heels clicked with deliberate rhythm against the hardwood floor, cutting through his frantic breathing. The aunts and uncles pressed themselves flat against the walls, desperate to stay out of my path. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my brother, stopping exactly 2 feet away from him. The security guards held him firmly in place, their expressions completely blank. Harrison stared at me, his chest rising and falling in sharp, panicked jerks. He looked incredibly small, pathetic, and utterly terrified. "You always believed you were a financial genius, Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to a chilling octave that demanded absolute silence. "You paraded around this city attending luxury galas, boasting about your brilliant investment strategies. You mocked my architectural firm, calling it a cute little hobby, while you played the master of industry. But you never built a single thing in your entire life. You only consumed." Harrison opened his mouth, his jaw working uselessly, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat rolling down his cheek. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in meticulous handwritten notes. I held it up so he could clearly see the dates. "I spent the last month going through the private family accounts, Harrison." I continued, my tone ruthlessly surgical. "I matched the exact dates of your excessive personal purchases to the exact specific days the corporate payroll accounts were drained dry. Let us slowly review the full extent of your absolute mediocrity." I stepped closer, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "May 12th, 4 years ago. You purchased a custom imported sports car for Felicity, paying cash. That exact same afternoon, $75,000 vanished from the factory maintenance fund. October 3rd, 3 years ago. You chartered a private jet to fly your friends to Monaco. That morning, $120,000 was unlawfully transferred out of the employee pension account." Harrison squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head weakly. "Open your eyes," I commanded. my voice cracking like a whip. He flinched, his bloodshot eyes snapping open to meet my cold gaze. January 17th, 2 years ago. You bought the vacation home in Aspen, putting down a massive cash deposit. That was the exact same day you forged our mother's signature on a secondary corporate loan, burying the manufacturing plant in toxic leveraging. You are not a businessman, Harrison. You are a common thief. You stole from your parents. You stole from your factory workers to fund your pathetic, desperate need to look important. He was openly weeping now, tears tracking through the sweat on his face. Lydia, please, he whimpered, breaking into a pathetic sob. I was trying to double the money. The market just turned against me. I swear I was going to put every single dollar back into the accounts. You have to believe me. You didn't beat me, Harrison, I stated, delivering the words with absolute brutal clarity. You just had a 20-year head start on digging your own grave. His miserable, pathetic sobs hitched in his throat. He looked at me, his expression crumbling into absolute despair, realizing none of his usual tactics would work. There was no mother to bail him out. There was no father to write a blank check. There was only me standing before him holding the meticulous record of his total destruction. The realization that the sister he had marginalized for decades was the architect of his downfall completely broke his mind. He sagged against the wall, his knees buckling slightly, supported by the heavy grips of the guards. I watched him hang there, a defeated, broken shell. The family legacy he had weaponized to abuse me was entirely dismantled. I reached into my leather briefcase one final time. My hand closed around a thick manila envelope that felt significantly heavier than the rest. I pulled it out, holding it flat against my palm. I stepped back from his pinned figure and walked over to the edge of the marble table, avoiding the spilled coffee. I placed the thick manila envelope down on the polished stone directly in his line of sight, slowly sliding it across the smooth surface until it rested right where his shaking hands could reach it. The top page of the document was clearly visible through the transparent plastic window. It was marked with thick red stamps. The bold, authoritative ink stood out starkly against the crisp white paper. It was a formal, binding federal indictment. Harrison stared at the heavy red stamps, his breathing completely stopping. His eyes widened to an impossible degree, the sheer terror finally reaching its absolute pinnacle. The color drained entirely from his lips, leaving them a lifeless blue. He recognized the official seal of the federal government printed clearly on the front. He recognized the specific legal formatting of a criminal subpoena. I looked him dead in the eye, delivering the final fatal blow that would permanently end his freedom. I didn't just audit you for fun, I said, my voice ringing with cold, lethal finality. I forwarded the highly classified offshore routing numbers directly to the active field agents at the IRS and the FBI. The wail of police sirens pierced the thick glass of the boardroom windows. The sound started as a distant echo bleeding through the busy Chicago streets below, and rapidly grew into a deafening, piercing scream that surrounded the building. Harrison flinched at the sound, his eyes darting frantically from the heavy red stamps on the federal indictment to the mahogany doors. The reality of his absolute ruin finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. He was not going to talk his way out of this. There were no shady bridge loans or corrupt bookies who could save him from the United States government. The heavy oak doors swung open once more. 3 individuals wearing dark windbreakers with large yellow letters spelling out FBI walked into the room. They bypassed the stunned aunts and uncles, completely ignoring the shattered porcelain and spilled coffee on the floor. The lead agent stepped directly up to Harrison, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Harrison Vance, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and elder financial abuse, the agent stated, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Harrison did not fight back. The fight had been completely drained out of him. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched sob as the security guards released him, and the federal agents roughly spun him around. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like a final definitive period at the end of his miserable reign. Please, Harrison wept, his voice breaking into a wretched, desperate whine. I can fix it. I just need a phone call. I can get the money back. The agents ignored his pathetic pleading. They flanked him on both sides, taking a firm grip on his upper arms, and marched him toward the exit. Harrison stumbled forward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the spilled coffee. He looked back over his shoulder, his tear-streaked face begging for some miraculous intervention from the family he had spent his entire life manipulating. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The golden boy was being escorted out like a common criminal, and his sycophantic audience simply watched him fall. The extended family watched in absolutely horrified silence. Aunt Beatrice had her hands pressed tightly against her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as she processed the charges of elder financial abuse. They finally understood that Harrison had not just lost their money in a bad market gamble. He had actively and maliciously preyed upon their blind trust, stealing their retirement funds to feed his illegal offshore accounts. Uncle Arthur looked physically sick, leaning heavily against the wall as the reality of his stolen pensions settled deep into his bones. They were completely ruined, tethered to a sinking ship they had eagerly climbed aboard. I did not offer them a single glance of sympathy. I had spent my entire life being called a useless parasite by these very people while they worshipped a monster. Now they were entirely on their own. I calmly closed my leather briefcase, securing the brass latches with a definitive snap. I picked up my tailored wool coat from the back of my folding chair and slipped it on, smoothing the lapels with deliberate precision. I walked to the head of the marble table and extended my hand to Mr. Caldwell. The strict estate lawyer stood up and shook my hand, his grip firm and respectful. "The legal transfer is fully executed, Lydia," he stated, his voice carrying a new tone of absolute professional reverence. "I will forward the remaining trust documentation to your primary office by tomorrow morning." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," I replied, maintaining my perfectly even tone. "I appreciate your unwavering commitment to the factual truth." I turned away from the table, completely ignoring the desperate pleading stares of the aunts and uncles, who were silently begging me to acknowledge them. I walked straight toward the heavy mahogany doors. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing the exact rhythm of my absolute victory. I stepped out of the boardroom into the bright hallway and let the heavy doors pull shut behind me, sealing the toxic extended family inside the tomb of their own making. 6 months passed with the rapid, exhilarating pace of a massive cleansing storm. The toxic debris of the Vance family empire was thoroughly and mercilessly swept away. I sat behind the sleek glass desk in my new corner executive office, bathing in the warm afternoon sunlight that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The panoramic view of the Chicago skyline served as a daily reminder of what I had built entirely on my own merits. I had spent the past half-year executing a flawless, brutal liquidation of the remaining Vance manufacturing assets. The useless factories were sold off for industrial scrap and commercial zoning space. The heavily mortgaged properties were officially surrendered to the banks, completely absolving my holding trust of any lingering toxic debt. Harrison was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting a criminal trial that promised a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. Felicity had followed through on her threat, filing aggressive divorce papers, and vanishing into absolute obscurity, leaving him to face the federal prosecutors completely alone. My aunts and uncles were currently embroiled in desperate, messy civil lawsuits, trying to claw back pennies from Harrison's frozen accounts. I did not keep in contact with a single one of them. My own architectural firm was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. The millions I had secured from the legal sale of the proprietary manufacturing patents provided the exact capital injection I needed to expand my commercial design division. I hired a brilliant team of associate architects and secured 3 massive corporate contracts in the downtown district. I was no longer the quiet, marginalized daughter surviving on scraps of parental approval. I was the absolute master of my own universe, operating a highly profitable, legitimate enterprise that commanded industry respect. I looked down at the quarterly revenue reports resting on my desk and smiled, allowing myself a brief moment of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. The numbers were flawless, reflecting honest hard work and brilliant strategic planning. I glanced at the silver clock on my desk, noting the time. I neatly stacked the financial reports, locked them in my top drawer, and grabbed my leather handbag. I took the private elevator down to the executive parking garage, where my new custom luxury sedan was waiting. I had spent years driving a battered, compact car, deliberately hiding my financial independence to avoid Harrison's relentless mockery and my parents' endless lectures on frugality. Now, I slid into the rich leather interior of a vehicle I had purchased with my own clean money. I drove through the bustling city streets, enjoying the smooth, powerful acceleration. I pulled up to Leo's private elementary school just as the final afternoon bell rang. My amazing, brilliant son ran out of the brick building, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. His bright face lit up with absolute joy when he saw me waiting by the car. He climbed into the passenger seat, immediately launching into an excited, detailed story about his science project and the new friends he had made. The heavy shadows of my family's toxic drama had completely vanished from his life, leaving behind a happy, secure child who knew he was unconditionally loved. After dropping Leo at home with his favorite tutor, I drove out to the quiet, manicured cemetery on the edge of the city. The late afternoon sun cast long, peaceful shadows across the rolling green grass. I walked down the familiar stone path until I reached the polished granite headstone bearing my parents' names. I stood there for a long, quiet time, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind through the old oak trees. I did not feel any lingering anger or deep resentment. The overwhelming, suffocating burden of their impossible expectations was finally and entirely gone. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a single pristine white rose. I knelt down and placed the flower carefully on the cool stone base. I finally found the absolute lasting peace they had always denied me. If you are currently watching this specific video and dealing with a deeply toxic family dynamic, please remember my story. You absolutely do not have to accept their cruel labels or ever let their severe dysfunction dictate your bright future. True revenge is never about screaming, demanding dramatic apologies, or stooping to their pathetic level. It is simply about holding your firm boundaries, trusting your own inherent worth, and quietly stepping aside so toxic people can be crushed by the heavy weight of their own devastating consequences. You hold the absolute power to write your own beautiful ending. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I wish you incredible strength and endless peace. The story of Lydia and the spectacular downfall of the Vance family offers a profound lesson in navigating deeply toxic relationships. For decades, Lydia was the designated scapegoat, constantly belittled by parents who worshipped a golden child and marginalized by relatives who eagerly enabled the abuse. It is a destructive dynamic many find themselves trapped in, falsely believing that if they just work harder, stay quieter, or accommodate more, they will finally earn the unconditional love and respect they inherently deserve. However, the ultimate takeaway from this narrative is that you can never negotiate with deeply rooted toxicity. True vindication does not come from screaming matches, throwing physical tantrums, or stooping to the vicious level of your abusers. It comes from absolute unyielding boundaries and the quiet, undeniable power of self-reliance. Lydia did not need to actively ruin Harrison. She merely needed to step aside, hold her ground, and let the crushing weight of his own fraudulent choices bury him. She armed herself with meticulous facts, protected her hard-earned assets, and flatly refused to be manipulated by weaponized family guilt. When you stop functioning as the emotional and financial safety net for fundamentally dysfunctional people, their house of cards inevitably collapses. Your greatest revenge is never their destruction. It is your own sustained peace and success. By walking away from the chaos and focusing entirely on her own legitimate growth, Lydia broke a vicious generational cycle and created a safe, thriving environment for herself and her son. Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries with toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your experiences and how you found the courage to walk away in the comments below. If this story of resilience resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering content about self-worth and taking back your life.